You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Happy Croc Month, Will.
Happy Croc Month, and Happy Croc Month listeners. Welcome to episode 194 of the Common Descent Podcast. This episode, we are discussing Alligators and Caimans.
Hey, Croc Month.
Croc Month!
Seems like a fitting topic.
Absolutely. Alligators and Caimans make up one of the two main lineages of crocodilians alive today.
They are half, kind of,
Yes.
modern crocodilians.
Indeed. And their history goes back a long way, all the way back to the Cretaceous, and they include today a good number of crocodilians, but have included some of the most diverse and bizarre and notable crocodilians that are famous from Earth's history. So we'll be discussing those, going over what makes an alligator and a caiman separate from crocodiles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do we distinguish them? What's the diversity today, which we can go through because there's only a bit more than a handful.
Yep.
And then we'll dive into what their evolutionary histories look like and the many forms the Alligatoroids have taken.
Yeah, it'll be a zoom in on yet another cool group of crocs.
Yeah, it's not often that we get zoom in quite as much as we do at times this episode. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun. We are discussing this because it's Croc Month and Happy Croc Month, but also because it was requested. It was requested by Josiah and Evan for Alligatorids and Deinosuchus specifically, which fits in because Deinosuchus, the big famous one, fits in this group.
It'll come up later.
Before we get to that, and before we get to our news, some quick announcements. As always, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon funds the podcast top to bottom and lets us do all of our cool things. When you join us on Patreon, you can get all sorts of cool benefits, but one of the big ones for certain levels is a shout-out. We like to welcome some of our most recent patrons. This time, we welcome Jamie, Ben, and Space Cadet.
Welcome and thank you for your support on Patreon. We hope you're enjoying your goodies.
Absolutely. If you are curious in checking out Patreon and supporting us there, you can find the link down in the description. You can get other bonuses like extra content from us, live streams, getting to ask us questions, things like that. So check that out. And as for extra content goes this month, since it's Croc Month and next month is Snake Month, we have extra stuff going on these months.
We sure do. Every summer we like to celebrate Croc Month and Snake Month in June and July in honor of our favorite groups of reptiles. By the time you're listening to this episode, even if you're listening to it very early, Croc Month is almost over, so a lot of our Croc Month stuff has already happened. We did our Croc Month live stream, which you can go back and rewatch on YouTube if you didn't catch it the first time. Our Discord channel, Croc Chat, has been open all throughout the month of June. And we had our Croc-themed Discord Q&A for this month. And on top of all that, on our Patreon, the Crocs and Snakes tier is open over the course of this month. Most of those things are going to end at the end of June and be replaced by the Snake Month stuff, but the Patreon tier will persist. It will become the Snakes and Crocs tier, but it's the same thing throughout the rest of July. This tier being open is a great time to join Patreon if you're interested, because not only do you get a bunch of goodies, you get Croc and Snake Month stickers, but the subscriptions that we receive at the Crocs and Snakes tier during June and July will contribute to charitable donations we will be making towards reptilian conservation organizations. This year, the organizations we have selected are for the conservation of crocs, snakes, and turtles.
Turtles.
We're expanding the umbrella a little bit. And even better, this year, a fan of the podcast has generously offered to match this year's donations.
Insane.
On behalf of Mayflower Enterprises, a small engineering firm in northern Indiana, here to help you discover your potential, capital D, Y, and P. Whether you're a newly founded startup, have been in business for 20 years, or just have an idea on a bar napkin, Mayflower stands ready to bring their Fortune 100 experience from automotive, aerospace, manufacturing, and construction to help your organization discover its potential through process development, personnel training, future-proofing, and more. At Mayflower Enterprises, they say, we have a passion for the environment, scientific discovery, and deeply nerdy hobbies that include listening to the incredible team at the Common Descent podcast. Aw, shucks. We are so thrilled to partner with them this year to help support Croc and Snake Month by matching funds, this is the important part, for the specialty tiers, that's the Crocs and Snakes tier, up to the first $1,000. Amazing. Huge thank you to Mayflower Enterprises for pitching in this year. A huge thanks to all of our patrons who have supported us in the past, and a thanks in advance to the new patrons who will be joining us and supporting not only our scientific education SciComm efforts through the podcast, but also lending some support to the conservation of some of our favorite animals that we share the world with.
Absolutely. It's very exciting. This should be an extraordinary Croc and Snake Months.
And we haven't even gotten to the good one yet.
You hush. This is my episode.
All right, you know what? Fair, I'll give it to you. You got it. You got another 2 hours. 2 hours for your month.
Behave yourself. As you said, next month is Snake Month, and at the beginning of that month, we will have the next episode of our Spotlight series coming out.
Spotlight 2024, a new episode every month.
Yeah, so check in to see which podcast we talk to this time. And finally, down in that description, you will also see that we have a mailing address. You can use this to mail us fun stuff, which people like to do from time to time. And we got some fun mail from Elizabeth, a postcard for Happy Croc and Snake Month, and some little Happy Croc and Snake carved figurines.
Yeah, these are super cool. We'll put a picture of these up. Mine looks like it goes to Jumanji.
It's very Jumanji
Very
figure.
Jumanji-esque. It's the right shape and pose and the right size.
Yes. I'm happy to add mine because I have a little carved like jade croc, and so now I have I have the beginnings of a rock croc collection.
It's got to be microchips or something.
And with that, we will wrap up our announcements, move on to our first official section of the episode, the news. Every episode, we like to gather some recent science news, things in paleontology, biology, evolution, and earth science that helps us all stay up to date with what's going on in the scientific world. David, what's the news?
Well, it's Croc Month. This is a Crocs episode. I've got news that is not about Crocs, but is about other archosaurs. Specifically, a newly discovered pterosaur down in Australia. This is research by Adele Pentland et al. Adele, who was our first Spotlight 2024 guest, who also does a podcast called Pals and Paleo. You should absolutely check out the first episode of Spotlight 2024. You can find it where you find our podcast, and then go listen to Pals and Paleo with Adele, where she talks about all sorts of cool paleo stuff. And I know she talked on her podcast about Pharaohdraco, the other pterosaur that she identified not too long ago, which I think we also talked about in the news.
Yes.
And I'm sure she will be talking about this one as well. Go check it out. Adele's great.
It's just podcastception, layer on layer.
This is the whole thing. So far, this episode, all we have done is advertise for other people's products. This is research by Adele Pentland et al. In Scientific Reports. And in the blog post, we will link to an article in ZME Science by Tibi Puyu. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic, your pterodactyls and pteranodons and such. Pterosaurs are quite rare in Australia, which is not a great place to find pterosaurs for a number of reasons. As mentioned in the article, fewer than 25 specimens are known from Australia.
Yeah.
Most of these are fragments, isolated bits and pieces, and most of them come from one formation, geologic formation, the Tullabuk Formation in Queensland. This study describes another pterosaur specimen from the Tullabuk Formation in Queensland, but this one stands out for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because it is the most complete pterosaur specimen ever found in Australia.
Woo!
This pterosaur comes from the early Cretaceous. This is the Albian, so around 100 million years old or a bit older. This specimen preserves about a quarter of the skeleton, including partial skull, the complete mandible, the lower jaw, the hyoid bones, a few vertebrae, several ribs, and various parts of the shoulder and wings and legs. This is a shockingly complete pterosaur. Just generally, pterosaurs are not usually found very complete.
Yeah, they're fragile creatures to begin with.
And this, for Australia, this is unprecedented. This is great.
Awesome.
Features on the skeleton allow the researchers to identify it as being part of a pterosaur group called Onhaguaria. Specifically, it is closely related to certain other Australian pterosaurs, like Pharaoh-Draco, the other one that is associated with Adele's research. And further than that, it is not only a new species, but also a new genus. Heliskaya petersoni, named after Kevin Peterson, the person who discovered and prepared the specimen. And Heliskaya, the genus, comes from ancient Greek words meaning sea and shadow or phantom.
Ooh.
To quote the paper, thus a flying creature that cast a shadow on the sea, or a phantom that haunted the long-vanished Eromanga Sea.
You got some good names for the pterosaurs you're discovering.
That's great. Way to go, Adele, and everybody else.
Heliskaya. I mean, I'm ready for the animated series of these pterosaurs, because their names are great.
Heliskaya is estimated to have been a good-sized pterosaur with an estimated wingspan of around 4.5 meters.
Ooh.
15 feet. This is a big one.
Nice.
It is distinct from other species of pterosaurs based on features of the teeth and the hyoid bones. Now, the hyoid apparatus we discussed at length in episode 192, not too long ago, when we talked about tongues.
Blah, blah, blah.
These are the bones that in most animals are located in the mouth-throat region that support the muscles of the tongue. If this had been published a month earlier, this animal would have been discussed in the tongues episode.
For sure.
For the following reason. The hyoid bones are about 70% the length of the lower jaw.
Whoa.
The largest ratio in any known pterosaur.
Whoa.
Big, long hyoid bones that probably mean a strong, muscular tongue.
Yeah.
Which the researchers here describe as probably being useful for holding on to difficult prey. This pterosaur also has curved teeth and is associated, as the name suggests, with ocean deposits. It was probably eating slippery aquatic food like fish, and that tongue might have been helpful for holding on to difficult-to-grab foods.
That's very cool.
They actually note specifically that the teeth don't show a lot of wear on them, which might mean that this specific species of pterosaurs was going after softer prey. So they might have been going after fish, or maybe like squid-like cephalopods, things like that.
Yeah.
And keeping hold of them with the curved teeth and a strong tongue.
Yeah, I wonder if there'd be more dexterity to a tongue like that for those floppier, softer things or something.
Yeah, I think in the paper there's a mention of like using the tongue to hold something against the roof of the mouth.
Yeah, pin it.
Yeah, which we've talked about in the tongue episode. There are some animals that will use their tongue to kind of chew, like to crush things up.
Smush things against the roof of the mouth or grind it against the roof of the mouth. So this is a version of that, but used for prey capture, potentially.
Yeah.
Very cool. Oh, that's awesome.
How cool.
Like, that's it. Good name, cool pterosaur with interesting features.
Yeah, not only is it a unique and exciting pterosaur discovery for its entire continent, which is very cool, but also it has a superlative feature.
Yes. Which often happens when we have really nicely preserved members of groups that don't get that as often. Like, any pterosaur we find that's super complete, we often learn something really neat because we don't get that very often. But it's very cool that just the layers of neat aspects of this discovery.
Yeah, this is a really cool find.
Awesome. Well, my news is also about an archosaur from a flying group. This one's a boid. I don't know whether this one flew, though. I didn't see whether they mentioned if it is flightless. I assume it is because it's a big bird, also from Australia.
We're very consistent.
This was noted in many of the news as a mega-goose.
A mega-goose? A beetle goose.
This is research. Oh, yeah.
That was a very dumb... that was a very dumb joke. Keep it in. That was very dumb.
This is research by Phoebe McInerney et al. In Historical Biology, and the article is by Evrim Yazgin in Cosmos magazine. This study is discussing a group of birds from Australia that were known giant birds. We've known about these for quite some time. Known as the Dromaeothridae, there are at least 8 species, and these were big birds. The largest grew up to be like 800 kilograms.
Yeah, this is one of the major groups of large flightless birds from the past.
Yes. Dromornis is one of the famous genus that gets discussed with this group. Certain aspects of their morphology, though, have not been well understood and established, notably the skull. The skulls have not been thoroughly understood, but mostly because of missing material.
Right. They don't tend to preserve very well.
So we don't have a good understanding of what their faces were doing and how it would inform this group. This has affected things like fully understanding where their grouping is with other bird groups and exactly what kind of bird they should be considered. This study is about a new skull from a species, which is Genyornis newtoni. This is once again one we've known.
I think we've talked about Genyornis in the news.
I
have a vague recollection of this coming up before.
This is another big bird, 230 kilograms, so not quite as big as the biggest ones, but still a hefty bird.
Yeah, it's a 500-pound bird.
Yep. This study's talking about a new skull from this species, discovered in South Australia, along with a mostly complete body fossil.
Oh, very nice.
But the skull is now one of very few good skulls for this group.
Yeah, this is a great episode for Australian paleontology.
Right? So in the study, they did a complete re-description of the skull, using this to just fully re-describe the skull of this species, giving updates to its biology and morphology, but also trying to figure out where this might help place this bird in among other groups. And they found a bunch of really unique features to this bird's skull. It had a tall and mobile upper jaw, which we've talked about that birds have more mobile faces. Their jaws and snout can move a lot more than us and other mammals. They compared it, though, to like a parrot.
Oh, interesting.
But shaped like a goose.
Yeah.
So like as mobile as a parrot's upper beak, but in a different shape.
Interesting.
It had a very wide gape and seems like it would have probably had fairly strong bite force.
Mm-hmm.
So a robust bite. They interpret that as likely meaning that it would have been being able to crush plants and other vegetative material up against the roof of the mouth like we see other goose-shaped creatures do. Surprisingly large brain case with an unusual shape. They noticed that just the shape of the brain case is unique, with certain bones enlarged in an unusual way. And that overall, this reanalysis shows that it shares a lot of features with waterfowl, goose and duck and birds like that today, and that with other evidences that seems like it was well adapted to aquatic environments. Some of which point to them having protections against an influx of water through the ears and throat. So it seems like this indeed was a aquatic, or at least aquatic adapted bird with a face very similar to a goose, which is why it's gotten the nickname mega-geese by so many of the news things.
Yeah, that it might have been eating and living in a similar habitat.
Yeah, it has a morphology that seems to be very goose-like.
Interesting.
It also has lended some information potentially to the placement of the overall Dromornithids as a group. It's often been wondered how closely related they are to another group of birds, the Gastrornithids.
Mm-hmm.
This suggests that they are not close to that group.
Okay,
And that
the
they should actually...
Gastrornithids is another one of really large-sized flightless birds. So it would make intuitive sense if you had these two groups of giant flightless birds being closely related.
Absolutely. This one, based on the features of this skeleton, suggests that it should be removed from that overall group and be placed separately.
So a fully separate evolution of that large body shape.
Yes. It instead supports it with a close relationship to a different group, the Enceriforms.
That's the group, interestingly enough, that includes geese and such today.
So it seems like they might actually be more close to big waterfowl than are other famous groups of large birds throughout Earth's history.
Yeah, so mega-goose isn't just that it looks like a goose, it might actually be not too distantly related from the group that includes geese.
Absolutely.
That's pretty cool. Also, an interesting thing to consider. I have sort of a specific image in my head of giant flightless birds from the past, and all of them in my head are either terror birds, in which case those are the carnivorous ones, which are walking around like theropod dinosaurs hunting small stuff, or all the other giant flightless birds from the past, like moas and gastornis, which are herbivorous, and I just always picture them in a forest.
Well, and
I've never considered the idea of one of those large flightless bird groups in not a forest.
Yes.
But in this case, on a shoreline or in freshwater habitats or wherever this is.
Well, I think because a bunch of them are more ostrich and emu shaped with long legs and a long neck. And those we tend to find either in like a grassland or a forested area, like cassowary. The idea of a giant water bird is not typically if I think of a large water bird, I'm thinking of like an albatross.
Right.
But
something that a large terrestrial, like a large water bird that spends most of its time hanging out on the ground is a goose.
Yeah.
Like that's about as big as I imagine. That's a really cool. And there have been like island goose species that have gotten quite large. But this is the idea of a semi-aquatic bird foraging in aquatic environments, bird the size of a tiger.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And like we don't know what the rest of this group looked like, but there were other members in this group that got equally and larger sizes.
Yeah.
So it could have been that in Australia there was just a group of large waterfowl type birds filling whatever niche that would fill.
Yeah. Now it makes me picture the Dinochirus from Prehistoric Planet.
Yeah.
It's a big theropod waiting in the water.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's super cool. I've got a second news that is not from Australia and is not an archosaur. It is not even close. This is research that technically is about bear remains, but mostly is about Neanderthals.
Okay.
This is research by Tomas Pianka et al. In the Journal of Archaeological Science. And we will link in the blog post to an article on My Modern Met by Madeline Mazdakis.
A lot of M's.
Very alliterative. This study focuses on a single bone, a partial radius, that's one of the forearm bones, of a bear. It's a fragment of this radius. The fragment's about 4 inches long or 10 centimeters long, just a little bit of bone, discovered in a cave in South Poland, dating to between 130 and 115,000 years ago. What's interesting about this bear bone is that there are a series of lines, parallel, consistently shaped lines, that appear to have been carved into it.
Okay.
So the bear is not the interesting part. The interesting part is that this comes from a time and place that Neanderthals were around, and this appears to be a modified bone. It was first excavated back in the 1950s and interpreted as a bone marked by Neanderthals. It has long been cited as the oldest known marked object north of the Carpathian Mountains and the oldest evidence of symbolic marking from Neanderthals.
Okay.
However, this study notes that it hasn't been studied in great detail. It's been cited as this has been the interpretation, but there hasn't been like a good detailed study of it. This study is a good detailed study of it. They examine the bone and the markings with CT scanning, with microscope studies, and also they compare with experiments, these sort of actualistic experiments that you get to do when you're doing archaeological or paleoanthropological studies. In this case, they used stone tools to make cuts on, they were using cow bones.
Yeah.
To study what pattern that leaves behind.
I love that studying this kind of stuff, one of the steps can just be, we're humans, they were humans, we'll do what those humans did and see if it looks similar.
Yes. It's like a much more scientific version of that thing from the behind the scenes of Jurassic Park where they're all running around like gallimimuses.
Yeah.
It's like that, but science. Using all of these techniques, they sought to investigate exactly how these cuts were made. There are 17 incisions on the bone. They're all fairly consistent. They're not spaced exactly evenly, but they are all parallel. The authors find that they do not seem to be consistent with this bone being used for something. Like, this isn't like wear because it was being used as a tool. It doesn't seem to be consistent with butchering. They don't think, based on the features of these cuts, that this is like an accidental side effect of something else that was being done with this bone.
Yeah, just damage.
Right, just damage in the process of something else. These appear to be deliberate lines made by the repetitive motion of a stone cutting tool. So a stone knife or something similar cut these lines into this bone using a repetitive motion. They said most likely a single carving person in one sitting. So the same tool and the same technique. And they note that a lot of the cuts have a, like, at the end of the incision is a little, what they described as a comma-like curve. So a little curve at the end that indicates that the carver was right-handed.
Yeah.
Using their right hand to make these cuts.
Neat.
With all of that together, they interpret that this series of cuts seems to have been an intentional modification of this bone, and it isn't a modification for any obvious use that we see. But, it's not being carved into a tool or a weapon or something that we're familiar with, so potentially some sort of symbolic meaning in these carvings on this bone. That sort of carving, these sort of striations and these lines, engravings, are known on objects associated with Neanderthals at other sites. This isn't the first time we've seen signs of Neanderthals carving symbols or something into bone or other objects. But it is the oldest example at least 115,000 years old. This, of course, then raises the question that we do not have a way of answering of what were these lines about.
Yes.
And that is way harder to interpret. They look kind of like tally marks.
Yep.
That's the first thing that comes to my mind is like, was this counting of something? It could also just be an aesthetic thing.
Yep.
Making it look the way that you want it to look.
Yeah. Like the first thought I had was whether or not it was measuring or spacing thing.
Oh, like a ruler.
Yeah, like a ruler. Or if it's a guide, like, are you cutting something else and these are the points you need to cut that thing, so you line the bone up with it and cut the skin at those points or whatever. It could be a guide or something. Yeah, that's why it's so hard to interpret these things, because we just came up with 3 very different, fully separate uses. And then it also could be like, is this like the age of someone? And is this a representative of a person? You know, so like it could be something ceremonial and having a fully symbolic meaning.
Yep. Whatever the purpose was, it does seem to be the oldest evidence of Neanderthal intentionally modifying something, likely for some sort of visual or symbolic meaning, which of course gives us just a little bit of extra insight into the culture and habits, and it's often just, the cognition, but more broadly speaking, what Neanderthals were doing with their minds and tools.
Yes.
How they were adjusting the world around them.
Very cool.
Very cool stuff. We talked a bunch about this kind of cultural insights into Neanderthals in episode 177 when Dr. Alex joined us to talk about Neanderthals.
Yeah.
So if your interest is piqued and you haven't listened to 177, go check it out.
Also, the right-handed note, that's
so cool.
That's so much fun.
That's so cool.
Very Sherlock.
I'm not at all surprised. That's one of those, I'm not surprised at all that we can tell that.
Yeah, like that makes sense.
And it's a Neanderthal. That's just a person.
Yeah, it was like how you can recognize handwriting if you know what to look for and go, that's a left-handed handwriting.
Absolutely. If you said, could we tell that a Neanderthal was right-handed? Yeah, of course we could tell that.
Yeah.
They're humans. They function the same way we do. The fact that we did tell that is very cool.
Cool. Well, my last news also has to do with interpreting behavior in the fossil record, but I'm going even farther from Archosaurus because it's about ants.
Okay, we're out of vertebrates.
This is way, way out of vertebrates.
We're way out in the grapes.
This is a study that is potentially identifying evidence for social communication in ancient ants.
Oh, they were carving notches into bare bones.
Yep, into the stems of leaves. This is research by Ryo Taniguchi et al. In Science Advances, and the article is by Murgakshi Dixit in Interesting Engineering. So when we talk about ants and ant evolution, the topic of... Episode 149. The topic of their social behavior is a big focus because...
Episode 111.
Yes, yeah, indeed. I forgot we had done a separate one.
We did both.
Yep. Because eusociality, the working together of a whole hive of ants or wasps or bees to act as a superorganism, is one of the most defining features of these groups. and has been a major aspect of their success on Earth.
Yes, and we talked in episode 149, we talked about how this sort of eusocial system is ubiquitous among ants, and how ants are among the top contenders for the rulers of the planet Earth.
Yes.
Just everywhere doing great.
So figuring out when that started to show up and what parts of it showed up when has been a big question with ant evolution, just because it's such a defining feature of how we understand ants. But that is behavior, and behavior in the fossil record is very hard to track down sometimes.
Episode 61.
Typically, we identify evidence of social behavior in ants by them being fossilized together, usually in amber. And so when multiple ants of the same species get trapped together, we interpret that as a decent sign that they were at least being somewhat social. They were together. It's not likely they all just happened to be competing. Maybe it was just a mating thing, but some form of social behavior was probably trapped by this. But that's rare, and that is not direct evidence of social and communicative behavior, because that's one of the key aspects of eusociality, isn't just that we group together, but that they are communicating, and they are collaborating with the signals being sent from individual to individual. This study attempted to look for direct evidence of at least this form of communication. The way they did that was by trying to look for specific sensory organs on the antenna that would indicate certain chemical communication.
Okay.
And support evidence for social communication between the insects. They looked at a piece of amber with 3 fossilized ants in it from the species Gerontoformica gracilis. This is Myanmar amber. So just as we like to note, there are certain concerns with the ethicalness of this kind of amber coming in and out of that country. But this dates it back to early Cretaceous, about 100 million years old. They wanted to try to look at these ants' antenna, see the sensory structures on the antenna, and identify what kinds of chemical senses these antennae are doing. Because the antennae do a lot of the smelling and tasting and sensing of the world around them, looking for structures called sensilla. But to do that, they had to develop a new technique because they can't see clearly through the amber due to the distortion of the amber and how light is scattered through the fossilized amber itself. So traditional imaging and like small scale imaging techniques wouldn't work well, like X-ray and CT scanning wouldn't have done the job. So they went with a technique that partially, like some of the steps were designed for this research, using lasers called rotating confocal laser scanning microscopy, CLSM. And to use this, they went through a few steps. First, gently removing the heads of the ants.
Sure.
In the amber, so just separating those sections of amber. Then they crushed and polished the surrounding amber around the head to create a very thin layer around 100 micrometers thick so that they could get a clear view to the structures on the head. And this is where the rotating comes in. To view and get a good look at the antenna, one angle isn't good enough, so they rotate it through multiple because one angle would shadow things in a way that would obscure the structures on the antenna.
Yeah.
So they get this multi-view scan with those lasers and this now thinned down layer of amber to get a very high detail look at the structures on the antenna.
Yeah, this is similar in some respects to photogrammetry, where you're using all different angles to then get a full 3D image of the thing you're looking at.
Yes, and it sounds like this was to make sure that you got a view of everything, because any one view would shadow parts and obscure key things.
Yeah.
So you're making sure that you're not accidentally losing something because your angle is only capturing or missing something else.
Makes sense.
This enabled them to see the sensilla and figure out what kinds of sensilla the antenna have. They compared it to modern ants and found remarkable matches, that they were very similar structures. At least a few of them were. Both had 4 types of sensilla used for things like detecting danger and identifying friends and foes. So they had sensilla that matched today's social ants.
Okay.
For at least danger sensing and recognizing other ants as their nest or other nests, which suggests that these ancient ants were social ants, at least to some degree.
Yeah, at least they at the very least, they had the sensory organs to detect those social cues. And if they're super similar to modern ants, there is a decent chance that they were living in somewhat similar ways.
Yes. Now, there are varying degrees of eusociality in today's ants, where you have some that are full-on superorganism all the time, and then others where they are individualistic a lot of the time. They go and hunt by themselves. So this could be a situation where they are living together or interacting often, but they might not be doing the superorganism thing. That's hard to tell, but does seem with these adaptations, they're likely doing some amount of interacting with other ants on at least a regular enough basis to have structures on the antenna to recognize your fellow ants and the enemy ants.
Yeah.
This means that that level of sociality in ant could go back farther than initially had been suspected based on other evidence. They know that this group of ants is one of the most primitive groups of ants. So this is a very primitive group compared to others. So if it does go back that far, this could be something that goes closer to the base of ants than we had initially suspected.
Yeah.
So this could end up restructuring our interpretation of at what stages the different levels of eusociality and when we might have seen them in ant evolution.
Yeah, this makes sense. I think in episode 149, when we talked about ant evolution, we discussed evidence that ants have been potentially social animals since the beginnings of ants.
Yes.
That this might be something that has just always been a feature of ants.
It might be something that ants started with and then diversified with.
Yeah. And the idea that ants were doing some version of social behavior like they have today, all the way back in the early Cretaceous, is very fun. The idea that a dinosaur could step on an anthill and then get its foot swarmed, like can happen to you today, is a very relatable, shared feature of an environment.
Absolutely. I also really like this because this strategy is something that can be used on individual ants in amber that don't have any direct evidence, that don't have any suggestive evidence that they were interacting with other ants yet. But if this analysis of antenna structures is a supported way to identify potential social behavior, any ant in amber that's preserved well enough could potentially be looked at this way.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's a very cool kind of analysis that I wouldn't have thought. I didn't know you could see sensory instructions on the antennae.
I didn't think about that.
That makes sense, but I'd never considered what the physical structure of the antenna is that allows it to sense stuff.
Well, yeah, I thought I was picturing it like our nose and taste buds, like where there are different things in there sensing, but like I can't just glance at someone's tongue very easily.
Right, you don't see the taste buds.
I don't see them, so I didn't think about you being able to just look at the antenna.
Yeah, that's a cool thing I didn't know about ants.
That's awesome. And speaking of awesome, the most awesome, Croc month, Alligators and Caimans.
You got another hour and a half max that I'll let you get away with.
The top of the top, the best of the best. After the break, we'll start talking about what alligators and caimans are and what makes them so fantastic. Alligators are one of the animals that I feel like have probably been mentioned more than most on this podcast.
Yeah, they're probably way up there. Like specific species.
As far as specific species goes, the American alligator has gotten a lot of airtime on this podcast, thanks to yours truly.
So we won't be discussing it in this episode at all.
Obviously, we've said everything we need to say.
That's it.
Moving right along.
Go back and listen to the other 193 episodes of the podcast.
He is hidden throughout there. Like the Da Vinci Code is the alligator episode. Alligators today are well known here in the U.S. They are our big crocodilian, and they are numerous and widespread and famous, and as a group are known mostly here in the Americas, but there is the one over in China, the Chinese alligator. Today, as is often the case with crocs, they are a small portion of what was a very diverse group. But they are one of the more diverse groups of crocodilians today.
Because not all of the alligators are alligators.
Yes, exactly. Because they include your caimans down in South America. And this group is the most diverse group in the Americas. They outnumber the crocs that are here. And they are the most widespread of the crocs of the crocodilians that are here.
Yeah, it's funny because we talk about crocodilians as being gators and crocs.
Yes.
Which leaves out some things, but crocodilians are actually split into the croc family and the gator family.
Absolutely.
And the gator family is bolstered by several species of caimans that are also included within that group.
And the reason you'll often hear it as alligators and crocs, even and crocodiles, even when it's like talking in more official terms, is because your two halves of crocodilia are the crocodilids, which include your crocodiles and your gharials, and the alligatorids, which include your alligators and caimans.
Yes, and they're also somewhat split globally, where your gators are much more diverse and widespread in the New World, and crocs are much more diverse and widespread in the Old World.
And this is one of those interesting things where some of that mirrors their evolutionary history, but there were tons of alligators outside of the Americas before they became centralized here.
Yeah, that split is a modern thing.
Yes, because their group goes back to the late Cretaceous. The Alligatoroids go back to the late Cretaceous and have been around as long as crocodiles have. Many of them did not look like today's alligators, and many of them looked very crocky. That body plan was more the default crocodilian body plan. So your earliest members would have looked like a crocodile, not an alligator. But they go back all the way to the Cretaceous, and today include 4 genera. We have the alligator genus, which is Mississippiensis, the American alligator, and Sinensis, the Chinese alligator. We have the genus Caiman, and the 2 other genus in the group Caiman, Melanosuchus and Paleosuchus. The alligator group is split into the Alligatoridae and the Caimanae.
Sure. So those gators and caimans, two separate lineages,
are true branches of the alligator group. It's not just like what we call the smaller versions and the bigger versions. Those are actual groups and are described as everything closer to the genus alligator on one side and everything closer to the genus caiman on the other.
The Alligatoridae is named very conveniently.
Yes. It is very easy to follow their groupings. Among those 4 genera, there are 7 species, with some questions on exactly how related a couple of them are. But you have the 2 alligators, and then among caimans you have the black caiman, broad-snout caiman, dwarf and smooth-fronted caimans, and the spectacled caiman. All the caimans are found here in the Americas, mostly in South America, coming up into Central America, and a little bit outside of there because of introduced spectacled caimans in places.
Sure.
We'll go into that. Alligators are found here in North America, and the one in China.
Yes.
Which is the only member of this overall group outside the Americas. And it's an anomaly. It is a weird member for that reason.
Yeah, the distant cousin, even though it is within the alligator genus. It's the same genus split across the continents.
Yeah, and it's not like super weird particularly for an out. It just is in a very weird place. And we'll talk about that a bit more later on when we go into the evolution, because how it got there is a question.
Yeah.
It's a big question in alligator evolution. As a group, they do share certain features. And I think the easiest way to go through some of those features they share is to talk about one of the biggest questions that comes up when you talk about an alligator. How do you tell it apart from a crocodile?
Yes, these 2 big main lineages of crocodilian are different.
Yes. It can often be tricky to distinguish at a glance what sets the 2 groups apart, because crocodilians are a very conservative group. They have a lot of really similar features. Internally, they are very similar. Biologically, behaviorally, many of them are very similar. So it's not a very super easy, like, New World, Old World monkey kind of thing of like, there are differences, but they can be a little bit hidden. A lot of them are in the face.
Sure. Which is the part you should be looking at anyway.
That's where you want to get right up close. The famous example you'll hear is that crocodiles tend to have more V-shaped snouts, more like a triangle, a slice of pizza, while the alligators and caimans tend to have a bit more rounded, broad snouts.
Yeah, like a paddleboard.
Like a paddleboard. That is typically focused on the American alligator, since that's usually what most of that conversation comes around, because this is the only place in the world where you get an alligator and a crocodile in the same place.
Yeah, southern Florida.
Yep. The Chinese alligator does not overlap with any crocodiles. It's too far north for any of them to overlap with it.
So if you're in its range and you see a crocodilian, you know which one it is.
Yep. Caimans will have varying amounts of that broad snout. There are some that have fairly crocky snake-shaped snouts, but they're a little bit more boxy. Like, instead of being a V, it's more like a angled, like trapezoid.
Sure, I'm thinking of like the difference between a white rhino and a black rhino.
Yeah.
The narrow snout versus, even if it's not super broad, it's just a little bit more of a rectangular.
It's a little squarer.
Yeah.
They have very kind of boxy heads. That's all. I saw it described that in many papers as more boxy heads. Another difference that is consistent, but once again, there are varying degrees to exactly how extreme this is. The way their teeth interlock is different. When crocodiles close their mouths, their teeth interlock like a zipper with at least one pair, and then some there will be others that stick out of the mouth from the lower jaw.
Yeah, like little tusks,
like
sticking
kind of little
upwards.
Warthog tusks.
And if you look at the shape of their skull from above, their snout has a little notch in it, where the shape of the skull kind of pinches in a little bit, where those big teeth stick upwards.
And that's typically right around where the premaxilla and maxilla, so the two bones of the upper snout, meet. In alligators and caimans, their teeth will still interlock, like they're still going top, bottom a lot of the time, but the lower teeth fit within the upper jaw.
Yeah, they have an overbite.
They have an overbite. Now, a lot of caimans have not as much of an overbite. You can still see the lower teeth when their mouths are closed, but the tips are in the mouth.
Gotcha.
The tips are not visible like they will be on crocs.
All right, and the same thing about the skulls. If you ever get the chance to look into the skull of American alligators, show this really well.
Yes.
Instead of having a pinched-in portion where the big lower teeth stick up, they have a little divot.
Yes.
In the palate, the roof of the mouth, where their biggest teeth fit in.
They've got pockets
Little
for
pockets.
each of the teeth. And the alligator is by far the one with the most overbite bite of this group. The American alligator has just a blatant overbite. You can barely see any lower teeth a lot of time when the mouth is closed. Caimans, a lot of time, you can see where that notch would be. And you can see that tooth more visibly on some of them.
Interesting.
So it's like almost the same situation as a crocodile, but the tooth isn't actually sticking out. One thing that will mess this up for anyone trying to use this, in human care, the teeth can get messed up, and a lot of alligators and caimans, the teeth will start splaying out, like they're getting flattened. If you were to like press the jaw between two boards and flatten the teeth out so they're sticking out horizontally to the mouth, that will start to happen sometimes. It's not sure why that happens. It might be a diet thing. It might be a way the habitat's built, but you will then find caimans and alligators in zoos that have visible lower teeth. And that's because of how they grew, not how they developed, not how they were, not their genetics or anything.
Yeah, this is something we've talked about before in regards to research, and it's one of the reasons why you always have to be careful if you're using zoo animals as your research specimens, because animals in captivity will develop certain traits that are different from what you would see in the wild. And this came up with your research when you were looking at alligator skulls. If you want to see the way that they naturally develop, you can't look at zoo specimens because they will often have their teeth are in weird positions.
It's the same thing that can happen to us humans where like certain lifestyles and cultures can affect the way our skeleton grows. You can't just use one human as an example for all humans, because were they wearing weird shoes that made their feet develop differently? Then those feet are not actually going to tell you what what typical human feet look like. You now know what that person's foot looked like. Same thing can happen with individual animals. The big definer, though, between the crocodilia lineage and the Alligatoridae lineage is salt glands. That's the big difference. Salt glands are not present and as used in all members of crocodili and of the crocodilids. Gharials and false gharials tend to just stay in fresh water, and there are many other crocs that basically never move into salty water. But most crocodiles do have functioning, and I believe all of them, but they do have functioning salt glands in their tongue to be able to get rid of excess salt if they go into salt water. All alligators and caimans do not. They have no salt gland. It's not even seems like they lost it. This group does not have that.
which makes the question even more interesting of how did the Chinese alligator get over where it is?
Absolutely. That is one of the reasons it's a difficult question to answer.
Yes, because it doesn't mean that gators and caimans can't go for a swim in the ocean.
We don't have salt glands, and we can go swim in the ocean.
Yeah, but after a while, that saline concentration starts to mess with with your body chemistry. Yeah. Crocs are well suited to handle the same way a lot of seabirds have salt glands that help them to disperse safely the amount of salt coming in and out of the body.
Especially if you're eating things from the ocean.
Yeah.
If you're eating fish and creatures from the ocean, you're going to get a lot of that salt when you eat them.
This is why saltwater crocodiles can go for a big ol' swim across the ocean and go visit other islands, but an alligator would have a hard time taking a trip, across the Gulf of Mexico or across the Atlantic Ocean, for example.
Exactly. You will see them in brackish environments at times. You will often see, if you do see any of them like out in the ocean, will be big alligators, where their size can help them resist the toxic levels of salt for longer. But eventually they will need to return to fresh water to be able to rehydrate and drink fresh water. They cannot drink the salt water just like we can't. I did find some fun facts related to that, in that crocodile and alligator kidneys work the same when drinking fresh water, but if they drink salt water, the alligator kidney starts working overtime to try to pull the excess salt out of the blood, while the crocodile kidney basically continues to work as normal, because they have salt glands to handle that.
Yeah.
So their kidney can't really tell the difference. It's not having to do a big job differently because they have a way to get rid of the excess salt.
Yeah, by the time it gets to the kidneys, it's already been filtered.
Yes. They also noted that it seems like crocodiles know not to drink salt water if presented with it, and alligators have to learn not to, based on at least the studies done in it.
Yeah.
Exactly how they're sensing that's not sure, and exactly what's going on with that, but it does seem like there is an instinctual aspect to how they interact with salt water as young and between the two groups.
Well, so crocs are also ocean wise.
Yes, exactly.
In a way that gators and caimans are not.
Yep. So now let's meet the members of this group and just get a little idea of what the diversity today is. The American alligator is by far the best known of this group. This is partially because it is here in North America, so it is...
Sure. It lives where all the science has been happening for hundreds of years.
It also is right up against big human cities just all over the place. Like, it's right... We live right on top of each other here. They are also one of the most numerous crocodilians in the world. I've seen them noted as the most numerous crocodilian species in the world. I don't know the exact numbers. I've seen a couple of different estimates thrown around of 5 million or 2 or 3 million total, but that they are often considered to probably outnumber any other species of crocodilian on the planet today. So they are also readily available for us to study and get to know very well. They are also one of the largest members of this group. Females can reach lengths of 6 to 9 feet, so 2 to almost 3 meters, while males can often be found at like 4-ish meters, coming around like 12 feet, but there have been members that get up to 15 feet, so 4.5 meters. They are well known for being very cold adapted. They come much farther up north than most species of crocodilian would be found going into a continent, and they can handle freezing temperatures better than other crocodilians, with the famous examples of them like freezing into the surface of lakes. But very often they will just wait it out on the shore during cold months and just not eat while they don't have the energy to digest. One of the most famous things about them, though, is that they are one of the go-to conservation success stories of any animal on the planet.
When you were talking about them being the most numerous of croc species, that was the first thing that came to my mind. Is like they were also one of the least endangered of the crocodilian species.
Yes.
But they weren't always.
When European colonizers first started interacting here in North America with wildlife, alligator skins became a notable commodity. They became regularly hunted, both to like protect cattle. They were also facing that they were a big predator, so they were a threat to
pets and
livestock in communities, and very much like how wolves were driven out of places, they were driven out. I remember learning about at one alligator place them talking about their tradition of when cattle drives would be happening, became a practice to go in and kill any gators in the watering hole and then water your cattle so that you wouldn't lose any to the gators. You just go and pull them out and kill them, as many as you can, or the big ones you can find. But the skin trade was a big driver of their hunting. This started in the 1800s, and by the 1860s, they were considered endangered. They made it onto the CITES Appendix 1, which means that alligator products can only be traded if they're bred in captivity. Shortly after this, hunting was made illegal. They were put into conservation programs and alligator breeding programs in alligator farms. Their population has been on the rise since that protection was put in place, and it is now still on the rise. And now hunting has been made legal for during hunting seasons, and they are now at stable levels. They're doing well. They're doing fine. They are considered least concern.
And they're playing an important role in Florida, eating the Burmese pythons.
Yep. And reintroduced red wolves.
Right, yeah.
That was one of my favorite stories I ever heard, is they bred a bunch of red wolves, released them on some islands where they were from, and when they came back, they were all gone, and the only answer they could figure is that they got eaten by gators. Because they didn't know to be worried about the gators.
They were not gator-wise.
Nope. There are some parallels to the situation of the American alligator with the Chinese alligator, but the Chinese alligator is a very different alligator in the fact that it is tiny.
Yeah, they're much smaller.
They're
also, as far as I know, much feistier.
Yeah. One of the reputations that the American alligator, then I often push this to emphasize people not to be paranoid of them, not to demonize them, is that the American alligator is a notoriously non-aggressive crocodilian.
Yeah, they're pretty chill as animals go.
They will take down big prey, but they are not regularly taking down large prey animals. That they're not taking down deer on the regular the same way Nile crocodiles are taking down wildebeest. They're usually eating smaller prey, fish, turtles, raccoons. So we humans just don't usually fall within their prey size category unless it's a very big alligator. Usually that's gotten used to people.
Yeah.
So they don't attack very often. We have communities that have lived alongside alligators for generations.
Yeah, the way that I've heard you express it when explaining it to people is if you can see the gator, you're probably fine.
Yeah, and this is often in contrast to a number of species of crocodile which are more aggressive. In alligators and caimans, there's a range of there are some caimans that are notably skittish and some that are notably more dangerous. And the Chinese alligator I've never heard as more dangerous, but as more difficult to work with.
Yes. It feels to me like what I've heard a lot about water snakes.
Yeah.
The genus Nerodia. Water snakes are not a dangerous group of snakes, but if you try to pick one up, you're almost certainly going to get bit. They're very quick to bite in defense.
Yes, very bitey, very scrappy.
Yeah. And I've heard that same sort of thing about Chinese gators.
Yes. The Chinese alligator, Alligator sinensis, is the only one outside the Americas, and it is only found in very small regions and populations in China. They are known from the lower Yangtze Valley of the Yangtze River, known from 3 different provinces in China, and their population is incredibly small. I saw one estimate that said that the current wild population is considered to be potentially less than 150 individuals.
Ooh.
Very, very... These are critically endangered. These are one of the most endangered crocodilians alive today.
Yeah.
So it's weird that the alligators are on 2 separate ends of the critical endangered spectrum. One is we very likely might lose this crocodilian in a number of decades if we're not careful. The other is unless we just go back to the way we were, it will be hard to get rid of this one. The Chinese alligator was also hunted for its skin. It also suffered extremely from habitat loss. And that's why there are now just these pockets of protected, more pristine areas it survives in. There are programs to try to help it. There are breeding programs to try to bring back populations. And I know that at least more recently, reintroduction has been attempted. And in human care, there's the number I saw noted was over 10,000 captive Chinese alligators. So they are easy to take care. They're easy. Most crocodilians, once you get them in a breeding program, do fine. Because they are not difficult to get to breed, and they're not difficult to feed, and they're not difficult to house. So
they're not picky.
They're not picky. We just have to stop killing them, and they need room to live.
Yes.
And that's it. Once programs get put in place, most crocodilians tend to bounce back. So hopefully we will see that here. This alligator is notable For being small, it is typically no more than 2 meters. So like just over 6 feet is about as big as they get, and that's for larger individuals. Mm-hmm. I've also seen them noted as being more terrestrial or burrow time spending alligators, like, and as compared to even other caimans, that they spend a lot of time in burrows and out of the water, which is something that comes up with a number of smaller species. They often tend to spend more time out of the water than the larger species.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I assume that part of it is that it's easier to spend time out of the water.
Yeah, you can move around because you don't weigh a ton.
Yes.
Like, for instance, here they've been noted to hibernate in their burrows during the cold times because they are noted as the most cold-adapted crocodilian.
Oh, interesting.
Just slightly more northerly and colder temperatures than the American alligator tends to deal with.
Gotcha.
They can handle the coldest weather of any croc cousin that we know of thus far. This size range is actually fairly common when we look at this overall group because a number of caimans fall within this kind of size range. A lot of caimans tend to hover around that 6, 7, 8 foot. The alligator is a larger member. The American alligator is a larger member of this group. Most of your caimans tend not to get that big. The most famous of the caimans is the spectacled caiman because it's the most wide-ranging. This is Caiman crocodilus, found within South America, but also Central America. There's also feral populations in Florida, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. They are very opportunistic. And I saw it noted a number of times in areas where larger caimans or crocodiles have been evicted by human activity. Spectacled caimans often
they'll move in,
establish themselves and establish populations there. So if competition is ruled out for them, they do well. It seems like really
the weeds of crocodilians.
Yeah, bigger crocs are the only thing that keep them from just taking over. They are found in tons of different environments. They include a number of subspecies, which the exact relation of these subspecies and how accurate they are has been, discussed and debated, as often as the case with subspecies. It was noted multiple times that distinguishing them is extremely difficult. That is very hard to tell these different groups apart with just visual analysis. It sounds like genetic is where a lot of the info is coming from. This is still a fairly small species. Females tend to get 3 to 4 feet and up to maybe 2 meters and 6 feet, while males tend to max out around 6 to 8 feet. So still bigger than the Chinese alligator, but still fairly small. Another extremely similar cousin, the Yacare caiman, Caiman yacare, which was considered a subspecies of the spectacled caiman at one point, is basically indistinguishable, but lives in slightly different areas, slightly different enough to be considered its own species, grows the same size, and I didn't see too much noted behaviorally or anything that separates it, but just a slightly different member. A notably different member is the broad-snouted caiman, which is still fairly small, max of 6 to 8 feet. So we're still at just 2 to 2.5 meters as our biggest members of caiman so far. The broad-snouted caiman is known in a number of areas down in South America. It is often considered a very wary member, very skittish.
One of those skittish ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I saw it noted that due to the wideness of their range and that they often seem to fall into cooler climates than some of the other caimans. So they are one of the more cool adapted, not nearly as much as the alligators, but still cool temperatures, less tropical, so to speak. That their time of laying eggs differs based on where they are because of those difference in temperatures.
Okay.
So you don't see a consistent timing for them laying eggs. It depends on where you find them. They are famous for their broad snout.
I was going to guess.
Yep. Caiman laterostris, broad snout. They have the widest head to snout length of any crocodilian.
Oh, cool.
Proportionately, their face is the widest of any living crocodilian. And it is notable when you see a picture of them. It's just this almost equilateral triangle, just very wide face that they use for taking down lots of snails and crabs and things like that. I also saw it noted that they are in more danger of being hunted due to their skin because they have less osteoderms in their skin.
Less armored.
Mm-hmm. Many caimans are more armored than alligators and have more of those skin bones, the osteoderms, even going around into the belly and sides. Evidently, the broad-snouted caiman is clear-skinned, I saw it called at one point, behind the head, or at least more so in that they have one of the best skins of a caiman only after the black caiman. And so it's made them a higher target for skin trade. And speaking of the black caiman, Melanosuchus niger is the largest caiman and is way bigger. It reaches the same sizes as the American alligator, and I've seen multiple references that the largest members of the black caiman often are larger than the largest members of American alligator.
Okay.
That it may be, in the very outliers of the sizes, the largest alligatorid alive today.
Gotcha. So within the alligatorid lineage, we've got two giants.
Yes.
We've got American alligator, but we've also got black caimans.
Which are not super big as far as crocodilians go. You know, the Nile and the saltwater crocodile and a couple of others get up to like 17, 18 feet more regularly, and at the very top 20 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So not the biggest members, but they are among the large members of crocodilian.
Right. Well, and they're getting up to almost twice as long as all the other members of the Alligatoridae.
Yes, absolutely. The black caiman is also notably, I've seen many times described as more aggressive, which partially just makes sense because it's a bigger member. It can take down larger food, and so it is taking down larger food.
Right. It's not as intimidated by something human-sized.
Yes.
Whereas a smaller gator, that's just too big for it to want to mess with.
Absolutely. Like a full-grown black caiman is now the largest predator in South America. It's the heaviest weighted predator in South America, and is a bit more aggressive than is typically noted for a lot of the other caimans. It has been cited as more often attacking humans than many of the other species, and compared to the American alligator. So it is just a bit more likely to hunt larger things. It also, though, has had its numbers dropped significantly due to the skin trade, and it is the most sought after for skin. There are still areas that have large populations, but in many other areas they've been reduced or extirpated. And then the final genus is Paleosuchus, which has two species, the smooth-fronted and dwarf caiman. These are unique among caimans because they lack the interorbital ridge, which is a little ridge of bone between the eyes, which is where the spectacled caiman gets its name. It looks like where eyeglasses would be connected to each other.
Yeah, the bridge.
The bridge of the eyeglasses.
glasses.
They lack this bridge, which is it found in basically all the other caimans to some degree. They do have other features of the skull that still make them very caiman-y. They still often have those little eye bumps, those little eye spikes that are very common in the caimans. They have more ossified faces. This is one of the ones that was described as having a very angular, boxy face. These species are also interesting because they are typically found together. In most habitats, you'll find one, you'll also find the other. So they have a very overlapping range. They also tend to be found in faster flowing water, which is unusual for the other caimans, but also just more unusual for crocodilians in general.
Yeah, we typically think of them in ponds or lakes or slow streams and rivers.
I saw it noted multiple times for these two that fast flowing water, they still can be found in quiet waters. And like at one point I saw it that the smooth fronted was fast water, the dwarf was slow water. And then another thing talking about the dwarf said they were fast water. They are notable, they're related to fast water environments quite frequently. They are also noted for living in lower temperature areas, specifically higher altitudes. 1,300 meters is what I saw.
It's also where you're more likely to find faster flowing water.
Yep, exactly. So it seems like mountain streams, cooler, fast flowing mountain streams is more common for them. They also tend to be more individualistic. A lot of the others, like spectacled caiman, you'll find in these massive groups. Black caimans can often be similar. I think the broad-snouted is a bit more shy, a bit more solitary, but these were noted for often just being single individuals or pairs. You don't find them in big groups like you do American alligators basking on the bank.
Sure. Yeah, crocs tend not to be social per se.
No.
But they will be gregarious.
Yes, they will
gather
put up with
in
each
big
other.
Groups.
Some will like nest near each other or raise young in certain areas. And I know caimans have been noted for that with young. And they are ones that will be noted for like fishing together. Communal fishing where they put their mouths open in the oncoming water, lined up with each other.
So someone's going to get a fish.
So that you're all just chasing fish toward each other just by being there and putting up with each other. That's been noted in crocodiles as well, but caimans are famous for that because many species are found in large groups. The smooth-fronted Snyder's smooth-fronted caiman, Paleosuchus trigonatus, is a even slightly smaller member of the caimans, typically only up to like 5 to 7 feet. So 1.7, 2.3 meters. Females even smaller than that typically. They are considered one of the most heavily armored members, and potentially I saw it described as maybe the most heavily armored crocodilian alive today.
Interesting.
They're just very bony skinned, lots of bony deposits in the skin throughout their hide. They're just tough little caimans. This makes their skin virtually worthless, so they are not particularly hunted for their skin because it's just full of pebbles. And it was noted that radio tracking has shown they leave the water at night, typically, maybe to hunt on land and in the foliage.
Oh, interesting.
So the water may be a safety thing, not a hunting thing as much, and they're going finding food out of the water. This is also, I saw noted for Cuvier's dwarf caiman, Paleosuchus palpebrosus, which is even smaller. Typical max length for males is 5.2 feet.
Whew.
1.6 meters is the upper reach. That was the lower reach for most of the others.
As big as they get.
That's typically as big as they get. Females, it was said, do not usually exceed 1.2 meters or just under 4 feet. This is maybe the world's smallest crocodilian today. Mm-hmm. The dwarf crocodile, the African dwarf crocodile, is very similar in size, I know, but I think typically the dwarf caiman is on average smaller, so it is probably our smallest croc alive today.
And still 4 to 5 feet long.
Yeah, still not...
Crocs do not get small.
They're not
small.
itty-bitty.
Yeah. It's an impressive feature of this group. These are large animals.
But this is... for ones that very often 10 foot is an easy size to reach.
Yeah.
From many other species, half that being your max is notably smaller. They're also the only crocodilian that the study that looked into it found wouldn't do a death roll.
Oh, interesting.
There was a study that went through every species to see, is the death roll universal across crocs? Partially just to find out, is this a thing that certain groups have, or did it evolve only in certain groups? And has it been lost in certain body types? But also, can we assume that fossil crocs probably were doing it as well?
Right.
Every species today can and will do the death roll. The dwarf caiman wouldn't. That might mean it just didn't want to.
Right, for that study.
It was being, in the study, they say, maybe it was just being difficult.
Yep. Uncooperative.
Just been uncooperative.
Keep your secrets.
But it might not use the death roll.
Interesting.
Which is very unusual considering every other croc we know of today can and will do it. So something different might be going on here. And that's all the alligatorids today.
Every one of them.
That's all, everyone. Like I said, there's some subspecies. There's subspecies of the spectacled caiman. And Caiman crocodilus is one of those, which I love. And like exactly the relation between it and the Yarkari caiman. The exact relationship between the three genera of caiman have sometimes been brought into question, but pretty much this is the solid list of species. I haven't seen many of them suggested to be split or grouped. Mm-hmm. So pretty solid. And that's all there is today. But they used to be one of the large groups of prehistoric crocodilians and have had so many different forms, it's kind of crazy. So we'll talk about that after the break when we go into the evolution of this group and their fossil record.
I'm excited.
So to talk about the evolutionary history of alligators and their friends, we need to go all the way back to the Cretaceous. True crocodilians, which include our modern groups and a number of extinct groups, but what ends up leading to the group of true crocodiles and true alligators, is estimated to have evolved somewhere around 86 million years ago, Upper Cretaceous. The Alligatoridae, is the group that includes eventually alligatorids with alligators and caimans, but also a bunch of extinct groups. They also extend back to the Upper Cretaceous, some noting it to be 83 million years to maybe 72 million years ago. They are some of the first crocodilians in the fossil record. Alligatorids are actually some of the first ones we see, and they might have been some of the earliest successful members of that group. So even though it's named after crocodiles, the alligator lineage might have actually been the more early rising of the two groups. One of the earliest members in what is currently our basalmost, so closest to the base of the group, member is Ladiosuchus and comes from Cretaceous Alberta material. There are a number of species noted to this group. I think the exact relation of them is potentially heavily under question. And it is pretty similar looking to just crocodile. It doesn't have that broad shovel-faced shape that a lot of alligatorids today have. It had longer snout. This one was a moderately sized. The full skull length was 40 centimeters, so not quite 1.5 feet, which makes it, not a small one, but big enough to take down some prey. It did have at least one or two of the lower teeth poking up into that grooved area in the maxilla. So it had that notch still. That seems to be more ancestral to crocodilians feature that is eventually lost in alligatorids. There were larger members. Ladiosuchus formidabilis, which was a North American member found in the late Paleocene. This one had a skull that got up to 65 centimeters. So that's a 2-foot skull with some change, but still very crocodile shaped. They compared it to Crocodilus acutus, the American crocodile, which is a actually very narrow snouted croc compared to most today. It also is noted for having several teeth toward the front of the jaw being large and somewhat cananiform, like exaggerated big teeth.
Oh, yeah.
Which crocs do have, but just the fact that they noted it, there have been numerous fossil crocs that had like almost saber teeth kind of situation going on.
Extra big grabby teeth up front.
This one seems to be one of those, so potentially a more macro predator going after bigger prey. And this holds true for by far the most famous early alligatoroid, Deinosuchus.
Yeah, that's the one.
This is probably one of the most, if not the most famous fossil crocodilian in history. It is a extremely large member of the Alligatoroid lineage. This is a very basal member, very early in the lineage. They were found on either side of the Western Interior Seaway during the Cretaceous. We talked about this in our episode on the Western Interior Seaway.
Episode 71. This is the seaway that split North America into effectively east and west landmasses.
Exactly. They're known from deposits from northern Mexico to Montana in the west and Mississippi to New Jersey in the east, along what would have been the coastlines of this body of water, likely living in wetlands that bordered this inland sea. Estimates for the size of Deinosuchus have ranged over time and have become a bit more conservative as we've adjusted our estimates. Earlier estimates put them at over 15 meters. And so typically the size I remember I used to hear in all my books would be 40 feet long. Nowadays, a bit smaller on the estimates of probably 9 to 12 meters. So still very large, still pushing above 30 feet probably for the largest members. This makes them one of the largest carnivores in their ecosystems at that time.
Yep, and these were ecosystems with dinosaurs in them.
Yep, which we know they fed on due to multiple feeding traces on dinosaur bones that can really only be matched to Deinosuchus due to the characteristic crocodilian aspect of the bite and the size of the marks.
Yes, if you've ever seen, there's a famous bit of paleo art, I don't remember who did this art, but it's on the cover of one of the art books that I have, which is a crocodilian leaping out of the water to grab a dinosaur like crocs do today. In Africa, we think of them grabbing wildebeest. That's Deinosuchus.
Yes.
Being reconstructed, taking down a dinosaur.
There were multiple species of Deinosuchus. There were at least 3 I saw consistently noted. Every now and then I would see a 4th that got mentioned, though I think that one's been suggested very often to be synonymized in one of the other species. Deinosuchus hatcheri was the holotype, the one it was named off of. The material for that specimen, though, is incomplete and spotty, and therefore it's hard to fully differentiate the species at all times. And some people have suggested that one of the other species, Deinosuchus riograndensis, should be replaced as the holotype because the hatcheri one's just not quite complete enough to be used. This has also meant that the face of Deinosuchus has shifted over time quite a bit because the early famous depictions in museum displays and in a lot of books were reconstructed off a saltwater or a Nile crocodile skull. And then as we found more complete specimens, we realized they looked very different and notably odd. So now you'll see it with a bit more bulbous snout and notably just odd shape. Still looks very crocodile-y, but just weirdish. There's lots of kind of swooping to the jawline in some areas. Just a little weird.
Yeah, not surprising that a weirdly sized crocodilian would have a weirdly shaped skull.
Yes, but it's why a lot of the early artistic depictions ended up just making it look like a giant Nile crocodile. Mm-hmm. And now we know it wouldn't have actually looked like that, and its skull features do solidly put it in the Alligatoroid lineage. It still does have a notch with 2 lower teeth to stick up into. I noticed that on one skull I saw that 2 teeth come up from the lower jaw to fit into this one notch in the upper jaw. So still very crocodile-esque, just with some odd features. Big nose was one of them. Big open nares. Another somewhat mysterious thing about Deinosuchus is that a number of specimens on at least the eastern deposits have been found in what are described as marine beds. Marine deposits that would have been a marine saltwater habitat, which typically isn't a big deal when we find crocodilians in saltwater. But alligatorids have no salt gland, and if that is ancestral to the group, then it would mean that Deinosuchus also shouldn't have salt glands. It doesn't have any features in the skull that show it would have had salt glands. So there's no evidence saying it does, and there's related evidence that says it might not have.
Yeah.
So did it have its own way to handle salt? Did it evolve its own way to live in these habitats? Was it washed into these habitats?
Sure. Which we've talked about that we'll find dinosaurs, terrestrial animals, in marine deposits every now and then. In fact, there are some known from the Western Interior Seaway.
Exactly.
So it's not out of the question that something could have just gotten washed out to sea.
One of the issues that makes it hard to really confirm whether they were living here or if there were more likely just populations inland a bit that were getting washed in is because there's almost no terrestrial fossil beds in Appalachia.
Yeah, the eastern half of the Cretaceous version of North America.
Exactly. That eastern section where these were being found, there's no terrestrial habitats for us to find because things weren't fossilizing over there the same way. So we can't confirm that they were indeed living out of the marine habitats. So it's hard to make sense of this picture fully. Were they just visiting it more often? As a big crocodilian, they might just be able to handle long periods in saltwater.
Or were these a couple of instances where they just ended up where they shouldn't have been?
Yes, exactly.
Is that why you're a fossil?
Yep.
Because you went it too far out to sea.
It is noted that there are very few fossils of Deinosuchus in deep water deposits, which is notable evidence they might not have been visiting them because those are excellent for fossil preservation.
Right.
So if they were visiting them regularly, we'd expect we'd find them there.
Right. So these probably weren't like open ocean animals.
So there might have been a more brackish habitat. I've seen that suggested for them very often because of these findings that maybe they were a sea shoreline predator to a degree.
Yeah.
But that's not clear. And there's plenty of reasons to think that maybe something else was going on, considering that this group in general does not show that trend.
Yeah.
We don't have other marine members in this group particularly. So hopefully we'll find more fossils that might help us clear up where they were living on at least that side of the world at the time.
I wonder if there's some sort of dietary analysis you could do to see are they feeding more on marine or freshwater diets.
That would be cool. Someone do that.
Somebody do it.
There are also some sister groups to the Ladiosuchus that start getting us closer to our modern alligatorids. The Diplocynodontidae and the Globodonta are 2 groups. The Diplocynodons are closer to our modern alligator lineage, while the Globodontans will eventually include the lineage that leads to our modern alligators.
Gotcha.
These these later members of the Alligatoroids now lack that upper snout notch.
All right, so we've left behind one of those classic Croc features.
Now we are entering the territory of more overbite. And still probably not as extreme as today's American alligator. Like I said, that one is notably just overbite. Many others have just technically no bottom teeth are sticking out. This seems to be starting here. Many of these are late Cretaceous, but a lot are also known mostly from the Eocene, so just after the Cretaceous. The Diplocynodons still typically looked a bit more like crocodiles. Often described as just more generally shaped in their skull features. While one member within this group, Baryfracta, is a small blunt-snouted alligatoroid from the Eocene of Germany. which is something else to note about this group, that it's known mostly from Europe.
Interesting.
These are mostly European, Germany and other areas in Europe.
Yeah, Ladiosuchus and Deinosuchus were both North American,
Yes.
which fits with the modern distribution.
Mm-hmm.
But here we've got some European members.
The Alligatoroids were very globe-spanning. This Berifracta has sometimes been noted as maybe a basal caiman,
Okay.
potentially, or something closer to that from the late Cretaceous. So it could mean that that split goes back that far, and a lot of the models seem to put it very close to the Cretaceous or potentially in the Cretaceous. The Globodontans are known from similar time frame, late Cretaceous, in going past it. They typically are smaller. These are typically, and I saw it, one thing saying not exceeding 1.5 meters.
Okay.
So we're talking
dwarf caiman size.
Dwarf caiman size. This was a mostly small member group. They're also some of the first very derived form of alligatoroids, whilst the others we've talked about mostly have been fairly crocodile-faced. These start to show more of a similar face to the Brachyfracta, which is shorter snouts, broader snouts, and enlarged globular teeth, specifically toward the back of the mouth.
Yeah, this is something we see in modern alligators.
Yes, but these, and I saw this noted, compared to modern alligators should be considered to not show this trend at all, with how extreme these are. These were compared to caiman lizard teeth.
Oh, okay.
Like pebbles.
Pebbles in the mouth.
Fully crushing teeth. And this is something that was very common in a lot of earlier members in the alligator lineage, is a very broad, short snout and flatter crushing teeth for taking on probably hard-shelled prey. That's often what we interpret that feature as. When you have a short, robust face with flat teeth like a stone, that's really good for exerting a lot of force onto a hard thing.
Yes, snails or shellfish or turtles. Modern American alligators will have, if you look at their teeth, they've got flatter, rounder teeth in the back of the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look up videos online of them taking down turtles.
Yes.
And they will put them in the back of the mouth and use those flat, crushing teeth.
Absolutely. The extremeness of the feature in these groups suggests that they might have been doing something more specialized than today's alligators.
Yeah.
Because like the back teeth on alligators are blunter, but still sharp compared. Like the very, very, very back ones are rounded over. But I think those are often even too far back to get anything really there.
Yeah, it's a noticeable difference from the front to the back, but they're still gator teeth.
Some of the ones I saw pictured in some of these groups are like spherical.
Yeah, it sounds like there are mosasaurs that have teeth very much like that. They're just like a fist each tooth.
As we continue in this group, we eventually get to the Alligatoridae, the Alligatorids, which is
a family that includes all the modern ones.
Yes. This gets split into the Alligatorines and the Caimanae. This split probably happened like 70 to 60 million years ago, somewhere right around that Cretaceous boundary. There are some members that have been dated back to in the Cretaceous that have been placed in either the Alligatorine or Caimanae group, so potentially they split before into the Cretaceous. We do have members of this lineage present in Europe, which is notable because from what we can tell, it seems like this split probably happened in North America.
Okay.
So that Alligators and Caimans as groups originated here and then may have dispersed elsewhere. Evidently, due to the number and features of the species we found in Europe, it suggests at least 2 dispersals, probably.
Okay, so this was a repeated thing, potentially. Them moving over, probably following coastlines or something.
Yes.
Across these connections between the northern continents.
And then by the Oligocene, the Alligatorine record is pretty much just in North America.
Okay, so European alligatorines was an early Cenozoic thing.
Yes.
That kind of died out after a while.
Yeah, they didn't persist there as long as they did, obviously, here in North America. But the ones, it seems to have settled here in North America mainly for them. Within, of course, invasions into South America with the Caimans.
Sure.
These early Alligatorines still had the bulbous back teeth and short, wide snouts. One group that a lot of members with these features gets placed into is Allognathosuchus. Now, I've seen this one questioned whether or not this is a solid group or not, and whether it's become somewhat of a trash bin group. Probably there could be some splitting going on, but a lot of those short-snouted, bulbous teeth alligatorines get placed in this group. They're still fairly small sized. 1.5 meters was still given for this. This would mean something interesting, that while today the American alligator and its cousins are often noted for having stouter, broader snouts than most other crocodilians today, they would be a reversal of this condition to go back to a much longer snout compared to their ancestors.
Yeah.
So alligatorines got a really short snout from the more long, narrow crocodile-like snout, and then lengthened it again with the modern groups.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about these earlier groups with their differently shaped teeth and differently shaped snouts, because specialized diet, that's often what that indicates, that they're eating something distinctive or particular, which isn't a habit we associate with crocodilians today. Generally speaking, crocodilians, like we said before, are not picky. An alligator will eat basically anything that it can get into its mouth. The crocs tend not to be specialists.
Exactly. And I have seen a couple of researchers who have questioned that application of specialist status to these, to be like, that doesn't necessarily have to guarantee they were specialized. That snout could still be widely useful. It might just mean that they are more heavily feeding on a group like a certain time of the year. Like maybe snails are their main food during one part of the year or something. But this immediately labeling them as a specialist might be pigeonholing them more than is fair.
They may have had a broader diet, but they were especially good at incorporating certain things.
So I've seen a couple who have cautioned just taking them right out of the generalist group immediately.
All right,
that
interesting.
Maybe there's more going on. Another member of the alligatorines, this one's notably a bit different, is Ceratopsuchus, the horned crocodile. This is from the Paleocene in Colorado, and is named because 2 bones on the back of its head have been stretched out into these triangular plates and made into horns. Now they're fairly bulbous, so they're not sharp horns, but they are projections off the head. And this is interesting because horned crocodiles are not unknown. There are members today that are often described as having more horn-like projections. The Cuban crocodile sometimes gets noted for this. I think the Siamese crocodile also is noted for having this, and there's other members in the fossil record that have these horn-like projections. This is one of the only alligatorines known with something I saw described as horns. I saw one other group mentioned with it, but this was also described as the only horned alligatorine, which makes it just a notable exception. It also had variable teeth in the mouth. The first 13 teeth in the upper mouth were pointed. The last 7 graded into more spatulate shape, and then eventually into that globular, rounded shape.
Interesting.
So it had a transition from pointed to more, not necessarily blade-like, but flatter, and then rounded and blunt. It still has a fairly rounded and stout face, but I believe this was one of the ones that leaned some of them toward that suggestion of, there's nothing about this face that says they couldn't be generalist, just that they might be doing something else as well.
Yeah, that variety of teeth is also good for being a generalized. Well, it's like dogs' teeth, canid teeth are like, they've got a variety of different tooth types.
Like if you still have teeth up front where you can grab other prey animals, then there's nothing stopping you from smushing up a raccoon with those back teeth. They just are better for crushing a shell, potentially.
Right.
The earliest member of the genus Alligator is Alligator prenasalis. This is from the late Eocene and is well known in at least South Dakota, I saw noted, and was originally classified as Crocodilus, but eventually got reanalyzed and interpreted as an alligator and is the oldest member of that genus we have. There are members of the genus Alligator that are still very deep-snouted, I saw one described as. Alligator munensis is from Thailand, which is notable since that is potentially a piece of the puzzle going into the Chinese alligator.
Yeah.
It had that crushing dentition and is further support that indeed the genus Alligator went through that reversal of snout shape quite notably and stretched it out, because the American alligator has a very broad snout, but not a short snout.
Yeah, it's pretty long.
It's still long. It's just much wider than your average crocodile.
And Chinese gators, at least to my memory, don't have particularly long snouts.
Yeah.
They're a little bit blunter faced.
Yes. They're a little bit less elongated than the American alligator, but overall have basically the same face, but not quite as surfboarded out.
Yeah.
Which leads us nicely into the discussion of the question, how did the Chinese alligator get to China?
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, the fact that they can't do ocean voyages kind of rules that out, and at least historically has ruled it out from major consideration. Also, the fact that the Chinese alligator is small and probably would have had difficulty making that trip unless a larger ancestor was the one that made it.
Sure.
It is not the only alligator and Alligatorid known from Asia. We've mentioned already there was another genus member in alligator. There are a few others that have been noted from there, and a couple of other non-alligator genus members known from China, Thailand, and a few other fossil records of the Chinese alligator that have been at least put within the same group up to now. The earliest currently known that I found in a more recent publication is from the late Pliocene, around 3 million years ago in Japan, and is currently our oldest known member. It's also a little bit large as far as the average size goes. It was about 6.5 feet long, so 2 meters. So still comparable to the maximum size of today's species, but just a large member. There's also a member known from the late Miocene to Pleistocene of Thailand. And then we do have a Pleistocene fossil in Taiwan. So we do have bits and pieces of the fossil record that show that they used to have a wider range, or at least were found in certain areas that they aren't found today. But overall, the fossil record is not great for the Chinese alligator. So it's hard to get a full record of what was going on with them. And I believe this applies to alligatoroids in general in Asia, that they're just not as well known there. We have members, so we know they were getting over there, but we don't know what the full diversity and pattern was there. For instance, there are like globodontans that are known from Asia, but are definitely not related to the ancestral lineage of alligators. So it's not likely that they made it back there in the early Cenozoic and then hung around.
Right.
It's probably that was a more recent dispersal of true genus alligator. So if they weren't able to make it by sea, that probably means it was a more overland or coastal route. The time suggested of this are probably somewhere during the Pleistocene, maybe a couple million years ago or more recent. Some have looked at a European route, going through Europe to China, but every alligatorine found in that area seem unrelated to alligator, so there's no fossil record of a passage of the genus alligator through that area. And if they were, it seems like they would have left at least a fossil. So the go-to answer that most seem to settle on is Beringia, the route between North America and Russia, that during a time there was a land bridge free of glaciers for them to move across. During the Miocene, there does seem to have been temperate forests there that would have probably been habitable.
Okay.
And even in areas where it might have been less than ideal temperatures, the Chinese alligator is the most cold adapted member.
Sure. They could have had ancestors that were a little better at handling more northern climates.
Well, and since they overwinter in burrows, which is different than a lot of other crocodilians who survive cold times, that might have been why they made it across.
Yeah.
Is that they have these habits of handling cold winters, and so they could make it over that land bridge. They also pointed out that we have other similar habitat animals that have seemed to make that same passage. Paddlefish and cryptobranchid salamanders. Both are very similar habitats, living in similar ecosystems that also seem to have made the same trip. So if they could do it, potentially the Chinese alligator could have done it. So that seems to be
eating giant salamanders along the way.
And paddlefish just num 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 num. And as I saw one paper put it, until a better idea comes forward, this is currently the best answer we have for how this one alligator got on the other side of the world.
Yeah. The only other thing that comes to mind is the idea that they might not have been able to swim an ocean voyage, but we do have records of animals basically getting washed across seas.
Yes.
You get stuck on a mat of vegetation or something. And this is a way that we, rodents and primates have been noted to have probably crossed oceans, which certainly in theory seems like it is at least as likely to happen to a small gator as to small mammals.
Absolutely.
But that's one that is very difficult to find direct evidence for.
Yes. And especially if we have another solution that seems easier to happen, it's hard to put as much weight.
Yeah, the big sort of hiccup in that explanation is what were either the conditions or their lifestyle and habits that allowed them to make a trip through a region where today alligators don't seem to be able to live.
Exactly. On the note of our other alligator, the American alligator, from what I found, it does seem that the American Chinese alligator do share sister status, so it's likely that one did begot the other to some degree, or they're very
closely related.
Yes. The American alligator seems to have been in North America since at least the Pleistocene. They've been in North America for quite some time as the species Alligator mississippiensis. From North America, we also got the caimans. Once again, caimans and alligators seem to have diverged in North America, probably latest Cretaceous or right after. We have our earliest caiman members that seem to go back about that far. I've seen a couple of things mentioning how many dispersals down into South America there likely were. The most common one I saw was suggesting at least 2 separate dispersals of caimanae into South America, somewhere in the Paleogene, probably. Though I did find one other that was suggesting maybe a much earlier single dispersal. And the earliest, for sure, caimanae fossils are 63 million years old. So we had caimans for sure right after the Cretaceous. And then crown group showed up around 18 million years ago, so the group that includes our modern caimans. The caiman fossil record is notably not as good as other crocodilians. I didn't see a particular mention of why that's thought that might be, and it might just be the environments they were living in, or I don't know if South America has as good a fossil record for these members as other places, but their record is much patchier than a lot of other crocodilians and compared to the alligators. By the Oligocene to Miocene is when we finally for sure see large numbers and well-established populations of caiman in South America. What was going on up until then is less clear, but by that time, it definitely seems that caimans had taken off on their own.
Which is interesting because that is a time period during which South America is separate from North America.
Yes, indeed.
The 2 continents are... So now, they're not separated by a vast ocean the same way that North America is separated from Europe and Asia. But that does suggest at least a little bit of ocean dispersal was happening.
So they had to make at least hops and skips, either to islands or across short areas to get between the two. Mm-hmm. And yes, absolutely, they were making that passage before everyone else did.
Yes, well, yeah, because South America and North America didn't reconnect until about 3 million years ago, episode 43.
Yes.
This is a group that was more than capable of making that transit before the actual land connections had been established.
So some of the earliest North American invaders of South America were probably caimans. But they started here in North America, so we do have North American caimans that are in the fossil record. Soavici greenriverensis is known from the Green River Formation.
That would have been my guess.
Here in North America, dating back to the Eocene. This is one of very few caimans known from North America, but we do have some. It lacks the spectacle, so it doesn't have that feature yet. It does have other ridges on the skull that are around the orbits, so might be similar structures of the spectacle, and maybe that was like an ancestral form of them or a similar thing going on, but they don't actually have that bar. They also had unusual osteoderms. I just thought this was cool to mention. Some of them are two-keeled.
Oh.
So many crocodilian osteoderms have a little like fin on the top.
Yeah, a ridge that goes down the center of the back of it.
And this is what makes that characteristic bumpy back shape with like not thin fin shapes, but like they're narrowed in the middle and raised up in line with the body.
Yeah, you see this on osteoderms of some lizards as well. And it's also common in the scales of a lot of lizards and snakes. You have this central ridge.
Evidently, they had some double-keeled osteoderms, and they had some unusual underbelly osteoderms, so they were just oddly armored, like notably unique in their armoring of the skin. Many of these older caimans still had deep snouts. This was still a fairly ancestral feature for the Alligatoridae. Procaimanoidae was noted for having still very deep snouts and wide faces with compressed teeth, so probably still living similar lifestyles to those early Alligatorids. The origins of many of our modern groups are not well known because many of them are not represented in the fossil record much or seemingly at all, I think, for a couple of them. But it does seem that by the Miocene, the early members of these lineages or the diversity that would lead to them had shown up, and the widest diversity of caimans was happening by the Miocene. Specifically, this is associated with the Pebas mega-wetland system. During the Miocene in South America, this was what was there before Amazonia was there. Before the Amazon rainforest as we know it now and the Amazon rainforest basin was established, there was a mega-wetland system that was there and probably started by 23 million years ago with the uplift of the Andean mountains. This system was a widespreading, covering 1 million cubic kilometers, including rivers, lakes, swamps, streams, and drained in a opposite direction toward the Caribbean. It drained differently than the Amazon basin does. This was also during the Miocene climactic optimum, when things were very warm. All this together led to the most diverse assemblage of crocodilians in Earth's history. There were more species and diversity of crocodilians in South America during this time than we've seen anywhere else in the world at any point. This did not just include caimans. There were other crocodilians living here. We have true crocodiles in South America today, so crocodiles were there. There were terrestrial crocodiles, the cebicids, which are known for being land-hunting, narrow-snouted, saw-toothed predators.
Yeah, like it was the Triassic again.
Yep. There were the dryosaurids, which were marine crocodilians in both fresh and saltwater habitats. There were numerous longirostrian or gharial-esque members. Gripposuchus, which was a giant member. This was one that also grew up to be over 30 feet long. As well as a bunch of caimans who were also super diverse. So, crocodilian paradise in South America during this time. During the middle to late Miocene, we see the continuing uplift of the Andean mountains shift the ecosystem from this wetland system to the early Amazonian type. And this seems to also coincide with the replacement of this diversity of crocodilians with the more generalized, recognizable groups and types of caiman we see today. But some of the diversity of caimans that were living in this place are as follows. Tons of small caimans with short snouts and blunt teeth doing very well. So that body shape, still doing well.
Sure, that seems
still
like
hanging on.
That's what the alligator lineage was just good at for a long time.
For a very long... It's as we often like to say, what we have today is not a good example of what the standard was. It seems like we kind of just missed out on this shape of croc face, with the broad snout caiman coming the closest, and from the pictures I've seen, not even close. Natosuchus is one of the more famous ones of these I saw. Very small member still, 4 to 5 feet long, maybe pushing 6. Very short round face. They said that the length to width index is 1.55. The only other crocodilian known to have a more extreme boxy face is Simosuchus, the terrestrial herbivorous crocodilian from Madagascar. Very short face, very wide for its length. They said the mandible is very shovel-like. It also has really weird dentition, not in just that it's globular, but it's reduced. They have far fewer teeth than most other blunt-snouted caimans. They said typically most of them have 18 to 20 teeth on the upper or lower jaw. They said Natosuchus has 14 up top and 11 on the lower jaw, and they've lost a bunch of the teeth because they have a large diastema, a big gap between the front and back teeth, which is normal in mammals.
Yeah, the mammals, you see that all the time.
Yeah. Very unusual in crocodilians.
Yeah.
This is not seen in other caimans and alligatorids, so it's not positive what they were doing. They're long and peg-like with a blunt top, so they're not flat round, but still blunt teeth. Up front and in the back teeth are that more rock-like shape. So they have these peg-like front teeth and rock-like back teeth. They suggest that they might have been like shoveling with their face and then grabbing onto things to crush, but a very notably blunt-snouted caiman. There was also a group of caimans called the Netosuchids, which are kind of the opposite. These have, and you'll recognize this shape as I describe it, long, broad, flat snouts, thin lower jaw, full of tiny, tiny teeth.
Yeah.
These are the big pelican-shaped snout that we talked about with other crocs.
Yeah, well, and the description of the jaws sounds like big salamanders.
Yes.
It's just sort of a long, curved bone making up that lower jaw with a lot of space within.
Absolutely. These had very long skulls to their body size, just extended. So if you take that alligator-shaped face and just stretch it out like probably almost once again lengthwise, but it stays thin and not robust with a very thin strap-like lower jaw.
Mm-hmm.
Morasuchus and Orthogenisuchus are both members that show this skull morphology. This is an extreme, what they call platyrostral, which is what the American alligators call today, but
Flat snout.
flat snout, but to the umpth degree. They are very similar to other crocodilians who have been found with faces like this. Stomatosuchus from Egypt, which is not related to the alligator lineage at all, is a very similar shaped crocodilian. This is one of the big questions in extinct crocodilians. What they were doing with this jaw is really mostly unknown. We have ideas of what it could be used for and how it might have functioned, but we have no croc that's shaped like this outside of these groups, so we don't have a lot of comparison to make behaviorally, especially nothing today that even comes close. It's often been suggested that this is probably used for some form of mass feeding, taking in large gulps of food. This is partially due to the fact that the teeth are too small to be good at grabbing large prey. The jaws seem to be too weak to take on struggling, strong prey. The openness of the lower jaw has suggested that it might have had what's called a gular sac, like a pelican. We talked about these a bit in the filter feeding episode because it's been suggested maybe those teeth were used to sieve.
Yeah.
But I've seen a number that have suggested that filter feeding is probably not as accurate as calling it gulp feeding.
Sure.
That you're not, like, a pelican's not filter feeding, it's gulp feeding. It probably leans a little bit more that way than, like, the throat of a baleen whale. How it was using that, though, has been questioned. It could have been sitting still in the water and waiting for things to get into its mouth and then closing it. That might be why it's so broad and so long. It could be swimming slowly through the water, more like a whale, and taking gulps. I also saw it to suggest that they might be doing mud grubbing and taking up mouthfuls of mud and then sifting it out more like a gray whale.
Right, like trawling through the sediment.
So what they were doing with that face, we're not sure. Like I said, Stomatosuchus, there's also Leganosuchus and Aegyptosuchus that also have similar faces. So, like,
that this has evolved multiple times.
Many times in different groups. It seems to be a style that was very successful.
This is a winning way to be a crocodilian.
We just have no member that seems to be doing anything like it now. So it's very hard to say what they were doing with that face. A close relative of the Netosuchids is another extremely notable caiman. And as I saw one call it, potentially best described as the anti-Netosuchid, because instead of having a long, weak snout, this has a very robust, fairly short snout, is Pterosaurus.
That one's another one that I've heard of and that we have talked about before on the podcast.
Pterosaurus is by far the largest caiman that has ever lived that we know of thus far. Extremely robust skull with big, robust teeth. Giant nostrils. I've seen it described multiple times by different people as you can stick your head and look around in these nostrils. Their heads are massive. Much like Deinosuchus, their size estimates have ranged, but typically their estimates fall basically within the same size range of about 12.5 to a little bit more meters. So we're once again looking at an over 30-foot crocodilian, maybe pushing up into the upper 30s for the very largest members. I also saw weight estimates, and this is similar for Deinosuchus, of like 8 tons or so.
I mean, it would have to be.
Like,
this is huge.
Massive, massive pressure.
A croc the size of an elephant.
This is also often described as potentially one of the strongest bite forces of any crocodilian, not only because of its size, but the shape of its skull, allowing for a very robust bite. I always find like bite forces hard to describe because 69,000 newtons, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, that's right. Well, how many trucks is that sitting on top?
Yeah,
and
even that, it's like I don't know how much one truck sitting on top of me feels like. 7 metric ton force is the other, which gives a little bit better idea, but
sure,
extremely strong,
real strong.
Probably one of the strongest bites of any animal that's ever lived.
Bite a canoe right now.
Yeah, like major crazy. Similar to Deinosuchus, the type specimen that was described, Pterosaurus brasiliensis, information that has been lost, and it sounds like when the museum it was housed in closed, the type specimen wasn't recovered. So it's been suggested that maybe we should name another one or as the holotype and type specimen because we don't have solid info. So the species are sometimes hard to discern with Pterosaurus as well. There are multiple species. I saw at least 3 mentioned. And they do range in size. Same with Deinosuchus. They're not all up to 30 foot. There are some that are 20 foot, so still big.
A nice humble size.
Yeah, just, a nice home-sized 20-foot croc. So, like, they definitely range from 20 to over 30 feet, depending on which species you're looking at. There are larger and smaller members. A close cousin, and what may be his sister species to Pterosaurus, is Acrosuchus. Very similar in morphology to Pterosaurus, not nearly as long. Its skull length is about 51 centimeters from snout to quadrate. Just to give you an idea of the similar lengths in the other three species of Pterosaurus, it is 80 centimeters, 126 centimeters, and 140 centimeters.
140 centimeters is too big for a skull.
Yep.
That's a meter and a half of skull.
Yep. Yeah, their skulls are like 4 to 5 feet, sometimes described as like almost 6 feet long skulls. Deinosuchus also has relatively like 5-foot skulls.
Yeah, which makes them some of the largest skulls in Earth history.
Yep.
Especially for terrestrial animals.
Yep. This has been interesting to have a sister species that seems to be similar-ish in morphology, but notably smaller, half the size almost, because it might give some information as to the evolution of the gigantism in Pterosaurus. Mm-hmm. Aegisuppus might be showing a more ancestral condition in the smaller forms of this body type. Some of the things it differs on is that it lacks those enlarged nares.
Okay, so you can't stick your head in its nose.
No, and not just because it's smaller, but because the nose is also more moderately, reasonably sized. There'll be pictures, and you'll get to see the nostril of Pterosaurs. It's hilarious. I think it was Brochu that talked about the only thing he could figure out that it was doing was inhaling turtles.
Sure,
just snorting turtles.
Snorting them right up.
The fact that this is smaller might mean that there's a feature to size there, and that's been described. A lot of the bigger crocodilians have big nares. Sarcosuchus has a big old schnoz. Deinosuchus has a fairly large nose. Pterosaurus has big nares. There might be something there, and the thing that's been suggested is heat exchange.
Yeah, that makes sense. That is a thermoregulatory thing. I could also see maybe it's a respiratory thing.
Yeah.
Bringing in lots of extra air.
Yep. So, seems to be some potential evidence that there's a connector to big noses and big crocs.
Interesting.
Acrosuchus also does have a squamosal horn. Not seemingly as notable as like Ceratasuchus.
Sure, but like little points,
little horns,
the back of the skull bones come to.
Which there do seem to be smaller ones in the smaller species of Pterosaurus, but the largest one doesn't have it. So they noted that might be something that a behavior or something. Since if those are decoration, if they are used in some sort of display, maybe you don't need that anymore at that size, or maybe there's something else.
You don't need any help looking intimidating when you're a 30-foot long caiman.
And so there seems to be a, as they put it, inverse proportion to the horns and the sizes of these caimans. They also know that the bite force in Pterosaurus is noted with deep depressions in the maxilla, and Acrosuchus has similar depressions but much smaller. Might be the same structure, might be a convergent structure, hard to tell, but it could give an idea of other features of the skull having to do with that increased bite force.
Yeah, that it's reinforced.
The nares might also be something to do with that. I didn't see confirmation if there's been physical tests to map that out in like a simulation, but maybe that's also some of the reasons the skulls are different, is at that size you're maximizing your bite force, so your face needs to be shaped different to take that on.
Yeah, redistributing where the bone is, the shape of the bone, to better handle stress and strain of having a preposterously powerful bite.
Absolutely. Another thing noted, and this one's just odd because it's not what you would expect for big beefy skull, they do have very large openings in the skull, the supratemporal fenestra, which is an area for muscle attachment, very important for jaw closure. In slender snout crocodilians, these are very large and are associated with quick closing of the jaw, not strong closing.
Sure.
So the fact that they have enlarged ones in both Pterosaurus and Acrosuchus might mean that they were also snappy. And so there might also be something else going on than just crushing bite, but also good at catching faster moving stuff.
Yeah.
And Pterosaurus also has false xiphidont teeth.
Ooh.
So slightly compressed, slightly serrated, but evidently not exactly xiphidont. So
sure, but xiphidont teeth are what you see in a lot of theropod dinosaurs. We've talked about Komodo dragons today have teeth like that, sort of knife-shaped.
It sounds like these don't follow the rules, and I think one of the things is like the routing of them is also different.
Sure.
But it's not true xiphidont for whatever reason, but they do have somewhat blade-ish teeth.
Interesting.
Further in the back of the mouth, I think.
Which would suggest that they're doing more cutting.
Yeah.
Which might explain why maybe they aren't as strong
Yeah,
in
maybe
their
they
bite
aren't
force
focusing on
as
that
we
as
might
much.
expect. 'Cause if you have shearing or slicing teeth, you don't need as powerful a bite force. T-Rex does not have slicing teeth.
Nope.
As much as we see in other theropods. T-Rex has big, robust, crushing teeth to go along with that crushing bite force.
And it sounds like these might be somewhere between like a T-Rex tooth and the Komodo, like
yeah.
a little more blade-like, probably still not skinny, flat teeth. Acrosuchus did not have these, so they were seemingly feeding in some different way, but even for just what seems to be a big croc, there's some interesting things going on.
Yeah, it's not
in the face.
just... Well, it's similar to what we said with Deinosuchus.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing something unusual for a crocodilian, which isn't surprising because being 30 feet long is not typical for crocodilians.
Yes.
It makes perfect sense that the way you're living is a little bit different from what we would expect.
Which is a question that comes up for the Alligatorids quite often because they have some of the largest crocodilians to ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
Like Deinosuchus, pterosaurs. Murrosuchus was also 25 feet long for the largest species. So even though it had a big flat face and it wasn't putting down a big bite force, it still would be larger than any croc alive today.
Yeah.
So some of the largest members of the group and some of the largest examples that we have fall within the Alligatoroids. And so it's the question of why do we keep seeing this show up has come up with this group very often.
Yeah, and there are also giant, similarly supersized crocs on the other side of the family tree.
Absolutely.
In the croc lineage, like Sarcosuchus.
Yes. Which I believe is pre-crocodilia, if I'm right.
You're right. That's right.
Sarcosuchus is a crocodiliform.
The other part and outside of true crocodilia is what I should say.
So there's multiple members. Obvious answers for like why you get big is what we talked about this in the gigantism episode. So listen to that. There's all those benefits.
144.
But it does bring up questions of like, how does a croc get that big? How does it function that size? There was a study done on the growth of Deinosuchus to figure out how are you getting that big? Are you growing like dinosaurs grow, where you grow fast? How we grow, you have a puberty. Mm-hmm. You grow up real quick, get to your max size pretty soon in life, and then you are big the rest of your life. Or are you growing like a croc, which they do have a quicker growth when they're young, and that peters off, but they're growing more moderately for a longer period. Based on evidence in the bones, it seems that Deinosuchus was maintaining a more stable croc-like growth, but they were maintaining that young growth rate for longer.
Okay, so not growing faster, but growing longer.
Yeah, growing at their top speed for them for a longer period. It said that they probably grew at that juvenile rate, so to speak, for decades.
Gotcha. So their sort of young growth spurt, as it were, lasted a lot longer.
Yes.
Interesting. So it's not just that they were like, the myth that crocs just grow and grow their whole life and never stop growing, which isn't really true. They plateau.
Yes. Like the first decade of a crocodilian's life, they grow more notably. And then after that, it plateaus with some like weight gain in there.
Right.
They mainly stop growing with some weight gain.
So this seems like they went longer before reaching that big size plateau.
Yes. They were growing more aggressively for maybe 20 or 30 years.
Interesting.
The specimen I think they said was at least 50 years old based on, which is fairly old. Most crocodilian species do not get to that age today. So it's probably that they were just living and growing longer as a crocodilian. And that might have been true of the South American big caimans as well. One of the other benefits that we mentioned with the nostrils is temperature control. Crocodilians are not ones that can maintain their own body temperature like we think probably most dinosaurs could have to a degree. They have to regulate their temperature with the environment. They're very good at it and very efficient at it. They can bask to cool themselves down by opening their mouth. They can sun themselves. They can move in the water. Their osteoderms help dissipate heat very efficiently. So they're very efficient cold-blooded animals, but they are still at the whims of the environment, of the ecosystem on what their temperatures are.
Yeah, we saw as we were going through the fossil record that a bunch of the Cretaceous and early Cenozoic records of alligatoroids are from places like South Dakota and Alberta and Germany, these northern places that they couldn't live today, but back then were much warmer, much more habitable climates for crocodilians.
Exactly. So getting big might have adjusted how they were able to interact with the heat regime that they were dealing with.
Sure.
But it also suggests that there were probably behaviors that would have shifted. One of the things that it implies is that they probably had a more stable body temperature, even if it was harder to adjust.
Sure.
Just
we've talked about this with leatherback sea turtles.
Exactly.
Who are so big that they just don't lose heat very effectively.
It's just hard to heat up or cool down more pounds of a thing.
Yes.
Just
takes
like longer.
It's harder to warm or cool a bigger room.
Yeah, or like a pool. If you can heat up your bath water much faster than you can heat up a pool, and it's just because there's more of it.
Just physics.
This probably means that they could risk overheating and might have not seen them basking as often.
Oh, interesting.
That the famous thing of seeing them sitting up on the shoreline, soaking up sunlight and warming themselves up that way, you might not have seen these big ones do. They might have just stayed in the water.
Yeah.
Because they're like, I've still got yesterday's heat.
It's warm enough.
Like, that's still in me, and the water's still warm enough that if I come out, I'll overheat.
I like to think that at least sometimes they would go up onto land and gape with their 5-foot-long mouth. Just a crocodilian mouth that's open wide enough that you could bump your head on the top teeth of it.
Yep. So hopefully.
A slightly shorter person could bump their head on the top. You and I might not quite be able to.
This also could explain why the Nares helping with heat control could have been important, because it has been noted in some other reptiles, like certain reptiles today, a difference in the heat distribution in head and body. Mm-hmm. And so the Nares might specifically be to help the brain from overheating.
Yes, and we've talked about adaptations like that have been noted in a bunch of dinosaurs with complex nasal passages around the brain that help to keep things at the right temperature. For cooling especially, more so than for heating up.
And so since you can't sweat, having that airflow increased in the skull might help their brain stay safe. Another big question about these large crocs is how active would they have been, these large alligatorids? Because larger size typically means slower. Just, once again, physics. An elephant just can't be as lickety-split as a mouse. Which also means, would you have been doing that launching out ambush hunting as often, or would that have been energetically exhaustive?
Right. That's an activity for the small ones.
Mm-hmm. They've noted things that in large members of saltwater crocodiles, swimming performance does decrease. They become less efficient swimmers because they're just so massive. They're just so big, which does have effects on how they capture prey. Many large members often, and this is especially for things like Nile crocodiles where they're together, the biggest member doesn't have to hunt. They just take the prey from any crocodile that's caught something.
Yes.
Because who's going to stop them?
Yeah, if I'm a 20 foot crocodile.
You just walk over and you open your mouth. Either the little croc gets out of the way or you're eating the little croc.
I'm going to eat something here is going to be lunch.
So like
one of the two bodies in front of me can still move. So it's up to you whether or not you get out of the way.
Exactly. So like we know they fed on dinosaurs for like Deinosuchus.
Sure.
But would the largest members have been hunting them, or would they have been taking prey or taking kills?
Right. Or when they did hunt, would they have been mostly going after like fish and turtles, stuff that, because like we said before, with modern day gators and caimans and even crocs, as famous and exciting as it is, the sight of them hunting big things on the shoreline of the water, for the most part, crocs are eating stuff that's in the water.
Yes.
They're grabbing fish, they're grabbing turtles, they're grabbing smaller crocs, things like that.
Exactly. So it's very likely also with the fact that being this big probably means they are not going to be very mobile out of the water, which we see in crocodilians today. Mm-hmm. Like the biggest example is the gharial. Once they're full grown, can't stand up anymore in dry land, basically.
Yes.
And the large crocs are not moving fast once they're out of the water.
And an 8-ton caiman is probably going to have a hard time, especially with that. You know, an elephant can manage to move around several tons, but it is built graviportally. It has its these pillar-like legs directly under the body to support that weight. Crocs with that sprawling gait and that big torso and those relatively small arms, I wouldn't be surprised if Pterosaurus and Deinosuchus had a really hard time dragging themselves around on land.
Generally, as a group, they're already not super efficient on land.
Yes.
And then you added multiple tons onto that body plan.
A big saltwater crocodile is already big enough to have trouble getting around on land. Gharials the same way. this is quite a bit larger than that.
Which probably means with thermoregulation, they probably weren't basking as often, so more time in water. Hunting, meaning that they could be more efficient in the water, and with mobility, they probably spent the vast majority of their time in water.
Yeah.
Probably even more so than we think of with, like, we think of today, like, yeah, alligators usually in the water. Push that up to 99% of the time or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, they may have left the water very, very rarely.
Which, interestingly enough, might mean that a person living in a habitat with these giant crocs might have been safer from those giants than from the more modern-sized ones.
Or at least they're young. Like, a young
exactly.
pterosaurus might be an aggressive shoreline hunter.
If it's on the shoreline, you want to stay away from it.
Mm-hmm. Which also would make sense. If the big one's out in the water, you guys hover around the shoreline, stay away from the big adults.
Well, yeah, I'm not going in the water.
So,
there's giant caimans in there.
You could, like we see with today's alligators and crocodiles, that the young hunt differently than the adults do. I wouldn't be surprised if a young Deinosuchus and Pterosaurus were hunting like a Nile croc.
Mm-hmm.
And the old ones were doing something different, because now they have to live a different way. But at that smaller size, you're not overheating, because you're not 2 tons yet.
Just the thought of a couple of 10 to 15 foot, American alligator sized, black caiman sized caimans grabbing what lived down there? Notoungulates, whatever weird mammals were down there in South America at the time. Grabbing it and dragging it into the water, and then starting to chow down, and then 35 feet
just this wake of water pushed in front of it.
Fully comes on over, one bite, and then swims back to the deep end.
That about wraps up our discussion of the fossil ones. There's one last thing I wanted to mention about alligators. That's one of my favorite personal things about the American alligator, is that one of the ways we are able to understand so many of these fossil groups is because of studies using the American alligator. The American alligator's got to be one of the most studied reptiles, like for published studies, scientific reports.
Yeah, it's a bit of a model organism.
Yes, and this is because it's common.
Yeah, they're easy to find.
They're not endangered, so we can hunt and raise them in farms very easily. They are easy to get.
Yeah, they're easy to find, and they're also easy to grab.
Yeah.
PSA.
No, you don't go grab.
Don't go grabbing alligators. But if you're a professional,
don't go grabbing alligators.
But if you are a professional collecting specimens, yeah, you could ask for a lot harder jobs than picking up an American alligator.
And they're one of the safest crocodilians to work in close. I've held an alligator.
Same.
And you can work with them. They are members of one of the last remaining members of archosaurs. Crocodilians and birds are our last archosaurs, so they're critical for understanding the the old archosaurs, like dinosaurs. And they're here where a bunch of research happens on this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So they're in the right place. They have easy numbers. All of these things mean that they are very, very useful in studying ancient reptiles.
Yeah. They're also a really unusual for the modern world example of a very large predator.
Yes, indeed.
And they are a very large predator. Obviously, crocodiles are also like this, but these are the biggest reptiles in the world. Mm-hmm. They are among the world's largest predators, and they're unlike all the other every other comparable predator in terms of size in the world today is either a marine predator.
Yep.
Or like a polar bear.
Yeah.
A big mammal predator like bears, which are very different and less comparable to things like, say, certain dinosaurs or extinct reptilian predators.
Yes, indeed. So they are so useful to understanding these things. I'm not going to go through in detail all the different ways we've used them, but some of the cool ones I found, just a sampling of studies, they are very useful in estimating sizes of extinct crocodilian cousins, mesocrocodilians. The body length and mass of an alligator is very easy to estimate off of its femur dimensions. Mm-hmm. So the leg bone in an alligator, if you measure it and run it through a calculation, it will tell you how long and big that alligator was pretty accurately. And this also goes for, using this equation, all of the modern day crocodilians pretty well. So it means that basically any fossil crocodilian that's similar in shape to an alligator can give us a pretty decent idea of how big that was, even if all we have is the leg bone.
Mm-hmm.
There are also measurements for faces and stuff, but if you don't have the face and you have the skeleton, if you have that femur bone, which is a robust, big bone, so hopefully it should fossilize well, you can get an idea. If they're shaped weird, it's different. Like the terrestrial crocs end up coming out bigger than they are because they have longer legs. And Deinosuchus came out smaller than skull estimates because it's got smaller legs.
Weird proportions.
Yep. But very useful. So a lot of these sizes that I've been saying this whole episode probably were using some of these equations. They've also been important for understanding soft tissue anatomy, like respiration, that circular breathing that they do and birds do, but they are notably different. Trying to understand what the ancestral form of it would have looked like was one study I saw come up multiple times. I found a genetic study looking at the evolutionary rate of alligators and finding that they actually have a rate more similar to mammals than we typically expect for cold-blooded reptiles. We tend to think that slows down the rate of mutation and stuff, and that they seem to actually be faster than we'd expect, which has helped to estimate where the divergence between the ancient lines that lead to birds and crocs in Archosaur might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other cool ones was confirming what similarities there are between birds and crocodilians to help us maybe understand what dinosaurs might have been like. Egg laying came up.
Yeah.
Because birds lay eggs, they form their eggs with two different regions of their uterus that form different parts of the shell of the egg. And here's the isthmus and the shell gland. In alligators, when they looked at it, they found two very similar sections, potentially homologous to those. And it could mean that that's how probably archosaurs have been forming eggs, going back to their common ancestors. So dinosaurs likely had similar structures in their uterus.
Yeah, we've talked a bunch on the podcast about how when it comes to interpreting dinosaurs, especially the stuff that we don't get fossilized for dinosaurs, behavioral stuff and soft tissue stuff, we do so by looking at living dinosaurs, birds, and their closest relatives, which are crocodilians, to infer, oh, if these both have it, that probably is ancestral, and therefore dinosaurs probably had this too. A bunch of that information, when we say crocodilians, we're talking about American alligators.
Yep.
Because that's the one where a lot of that data has come from.
And it's one of those where there's tons of others that will, like Nile crocodiles get used because they are also very numerous.
Sure.
Spectacled caimans will get used because they're very numerous. And typically for these comparative studies, very often those others will pop up, but alligator will be there in every single one.
Yeah. It's just they're hard to avoid.
It's silly not to use them.
It's silly not to use them. They're everywhere.
So I love that fact that they are such a boon to scientific study outside of just understanding them as a species.
Yeah.
And that's very cool.
Well, and they represent a corner of the animal family tree that we're very interested in, because they are where dinosaurs and pterosaurs and all them are. But they also represent a lifestyle and body plan and habitat that is unique among living animals, right? There's really not much else that is like crocs.
Nope.
Gators and other big crocodilians are doing something that is very distinctive to them. But then also at the same time, as we've talked about many times before, what American alligators are doing today is something that someone has been doing for basically the last 300 million years.
It seems like that niche has been filled the whole time.
That body shape and general lifestyle and habit, there have surely been differences. Like we were just talking about even within Alligatoridae.
Yes, there are weird members that are doing interesting things.
Yes, but something similar to this, whether it's been crocs or phytosaurs or early tetrapods back in the Paleozoic, whatever that is something that has been very common throughout Earth history. And alligators and other crocs today are one of the best ways we have to learn about what that is like.
Absolutely.
They're very informative species.
Well, and like you mentioned, them being a big predator, they're also the crocodilians are the largest reptiles today. So I've seen them in motion studies of like, how would large reptiles of the past have moved? The only ones we can really look at to try to compare are the biggest reptiles today. And alligators are one of the biggest members, so they also fall into that category.
Yes. They're also very handy for bite force studies.
Yes!
Because if you're like, well, what was T-Rex's bite force like? For a modern comparison, there are plenty of mammals that have surprisingly strong bite forces. But if you want a terrestrial animal with a powerful bite force, crocodilians.
Yep.
Those are the champions of bite force outside of, like, sharks. Like great white sharks in the ocean.
And also, that's one of the fun things about the giant ones like pterosaurs and Deinosuchus. When they've done those bite force tests, Brochu and Erickson did one that they went through every single species at multiple sizes and measured all the bite force, and they found that the consistent trend is the bigger the croc, the bigger the bite force. The bigger the croc, the bigger the bite force. So that's why people just pointed to pterosaurs and Deinosuchus and go, probably the strongest things that ever bit down.
Yeah.
Like,
just chopping trees in half.
Maybe Megalodon had a comparable one, but even then, probably the strongest bite force of any animal that ever lived is those big crocodilians.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. That will wrap up our alligators episode.
Happy Croc Month.
Happy Croc Month. Oh, I love them so much. This was so much fun. I got to learn a ton. I didn't know about all the really blunt-snouted ones, the like Natasuchus. That's fantastic. Before we wrap up the episode, we have one section left, which is our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer one of the questions presented to us by our patrons. That's one of the benefits you can get at certain levels. What's our patron question today?
This episode's patron question is a very fitting one for this Croc and Snake Month season. This comes from a patron who goes by the moniker Ambulocetus.
Another semi-croc shaped creature.
Another sort of croc shaped animal. The prehistoric creature Ambulocetus, presumably not this patron. It's probably not croc shaped. Although, good for you.
Maybe. Good on you. You've taken care of yourself.
Ambulocetus asks, David, what is your favorite thing about crocs? And Will, what is your favorite thing about snakes? I'd love to hear your opinions on each other's favorite animal types.
Absolutely.
I'll go first.
Yes.
Don't tell anybody this, I've always really liked crocodilians. They're super cool animals. I think my favorite thing about crocs, and the thing that I've always really sort of admired and appreciated about them, is that they are impressive in a very simple and straightforward way. Mm-hmm. Like snakes are great. I love snakes. I love the complexity and how derived snakes are. Crocs are big, they're powerful, and they are just, you look at a croc and you know what it does.
Yeah.
Big mouth, chomps down on food. There's not a lot in the way of like complicated behavioral strategies that we see in a lot of other animals. They're not using like venom or anything weird like that. They are a very simple blueprint for how to be a large predator.
Yep.
And they're extraordinarily efficient at it. I think when I was little, people would ask the question, if you could be any animal, what animal would you be? I would always say a crocodile.
Yeah.
Because then I'm huge, I don't need a lot, nothing's going to mess with me as long as I don't get too close to another crocodile or a hippo.
Yep.
And then you just get to hang out, and you're perfectly safe, and you eat whatever you want, and you're extraordinarily powerful. They have the same appeal as, like, the strong character on the superhero team.
Oh, I was going to compare them to like fighters or barbarians in D&D.
Yeah.
It's like, you're not complicated. You're kind of seen as like one of the default classes, but you're real good at what you do. And people just, big muscly guy with an axe or a guy covered in armor with a sword, I get it. Yeah. I know what you're about to do to me.
I think that is very appealing to me about crocodilians in general. They are simple and straightforward and extremely effective.
Yeah. My favorite thing about snakes.
And then we end the episode and Will doesn't have to
Anyway, we ran out of footage. We ran out of recording.
The tape ran out. We ran out of tape.
I think my favorite, there's tons of cool things about snakes. The specializations and like you've talked about the way they've adapted to different like habitats and ways of life. Their movement, though, is the thing I think of first when I'm just, like, admiring a snake or thinking of a cool snake scene or character. It's just, like, wherever their face goes is where their body follows. Mm-hmm. There's something about that's very satisfying.
It's very satisfying to watch.
Yeah. It's like that old screensaver with the pipes.
Yeah.
That would fill in the screen with the pipe. Watching a snake feels like that.
Well, they move in a very distinctive way that even other snake-shaped animals don't tend to move.
Yeah.
Snakes have a very distinctive styles of locomotion.
Well, and they have this beautiful, like, optical illusion that happens when you're watching, like, especially a fast-moving one, like a racer or something, and you'll see them and you'll be like, oh, there it is, and then you won't you won't catch that you've been looking at the same spot, but 6 inches of snake has moved by because it's just the blurring of the scales. And so you have this moment where suddenly it's the tail and it's gone. You're like, oh wait, I thought I had my eye on it, but it was moving, and the body was staying in the same shape the whole time as it moved through that spot. So it's like watching water move through a pipe.
It's like watching a train.
Yeah. And there's something very satisfying and just like supremely efficient feeling about the way they move. I love watching a snake's tail follow its path and like continuing along, like even though the tail is like up in the air for a moment or something, it still follows the curve. And it's like that's not necessary for you to do. You could be doing whatever you wanted with that tail. Rattlesnakes do, like their tail is just doing its own thing. It's sticking up and, you know, moving, but you still followed it, and that's very satisfying.
Yeah.
It's so pretty.
While you were explaining that, I was getting ready to like jump in and add more stuff and be like, another cool thing. And then I was like, that's not what the question was.
This is next month.
That's not what the point was. Next month, we'll geek out all sorts about snakes.
Pretty cool animals.
They are indeed.
Thank you for that question, Ambulocetus. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed this Croc Month episode. We had tons of fun going through it. I absolutely found it delightful to get to just look up Alligatorids a whole bunch for the notes, so thank you for that. Check out the blog post to be able to see lots of pictures, lots of the links. There's tons of cool images for the modern and fossil groups, so check those out. Remember that it is indeed Croc and Snake Month.
It's true. By the time you're listening to this, if you listen to it around the time it comes out, Croc Month is almost over.
Yep.
And we'll be moving on to Snake Month, which means that the Croc Chat channel on Discord will be closing at the end of June and being replaced by the Snake Stuff channel, but the Crocs and Snakes tier on Patreon will be open throughout both June and July. And as a reminder, if you join the Crocs and Snakes tier on Patreon during June and July, when it is available, you will not only be supporting us, you will also be contributing to donations we will be making towards reptile conservation, so you can support us and reptiles at the same time. And it's being matched this year by a generous donor, which is fantastic. So it's a great time to hop into the Crocs and Snakes tier.
Absolutely. So links down in the description. You can find those. Jump into the Croc chat before it closes. Thank you to our requesters for this episode and our new patrons. Thank you and welcome. Extra special thank you to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Daniel the Bug Lover, Robert Mart, and Melissa Barksdale. And with that, we can see ya later.
Oh, that's pretty good. There's a dwarf caiman and there's a dwarf crocodile.
Yes.
And I've been trying to see if there's a joke I could make about dwarf gator.
Yeah.
As a Star Wars joke, and I don't.
I have a Darth Gator shirt.
You have a Darth Gator shirt, that's true.
But a dwarf gator would be...
Dwarf gator. Somebody out there come up with the dwarf gator joke.
Or draw a tiny little alligator in Darth Vader's helmet standing in the rebel blockade runner hallway.
Sure.
Surrounded by the dead rebels.
A dwarf gator joke would be like a Spaceballs bit.
Yep.
That'd be pretty good.
Yep.
Anyway, in a while.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.